A monstrous wolf snaps its massive jaws shut, but a lone fighter wedges a wooden branch right between its fangs. Refusing to become puppy chow, the man winds up a desperate haymaker. He clocks the towering beast right in the snout with a brutal punch. But the monster just bites down harder, cracking the makeshift weapon under its immense jaw pressure. Throwing caution to the wind, he hammers another wild fist straight into the beast's neck. A defiant roar rips from his throat as his right eye suddenly flares with a blinding, mysterious blue energy. The giant wolf's jaws violently clamp shut, completely obliterating his only line of defense. An agonizing, fiery heat surges through his body, forcing a blood-curdling scream from his lungs. But just as the end seems near, a blinding flash of light erupts and the beast lets out a startled yelp. It's an absolute life-or-death cliffhanger. But to understand how our boy ended up brawling with giant monsters, we need to rewind to where this nightmare started. On a freezing winter evening, the snowy city streets are absolutely bumping with festive cheer and classic Christmas carols. Laughter rings out through the winter chill as the oblivious crowds celebrate the holiday season. A picture-perfect family strolls hand in hand down the sidewalk, soaking up the holiday magic. But their wholesome walk is suddenly cut short when a towering, imposing figure in a dark coat blocks their path. The little girl in the pink coat gazes up in absolute awe at the sheer size of the stranger. Our hero silently steps aside, quietly wondering why he's always the one shrinking back to make room for others. As he wades through the sea of happy couples, the crushing reality sets in. He's the only person out here completely alone. Eager to escape the suffocating holiday cheer, the tall dark-haired man makes a beeline for the nearest subway entrance. Just before he can dip underground, something catches his eye. Turns out, he isn't the only solitary soul braving the freezing temperatures tonight. A destitute, eccentric Santa is kneeling right in the snow, looking completely down on his luck. The old man's cardboard sign is asking for wishes, and normally, my guy would just keep walking without a second glance. Except today is Christmas Eve, the exact anniversary of the tragic accident that took his parents and left him entirely on his own. Feeling a rare pang of sympathy for a fellow outcast, our boy reaches in to pull out his wallet. Our guy hands over a crisp bill and a warm kimbap, figuring that's his good deed for the year. But instead of taking the food, the old man instantly snatches the tall dark-haired man's hand with both of his own. He praises the giant's kind soul and insists that he absolutely has to repay him by granting a wish. Thinking he just triggered a random NPC encounter with a crazy person, our hero tries to yank his arm back. Except the Santa's grip suddenly tightens with absolute bone-crushing force. The tall dark-haired man is built like a tank, but he is left completely immobilized and trembling under the frail elder's supernatural strength. A desperate image of the pleading elder flashes in his eye, begging for a wish so he can finally return to Santa Village. Realizing he's completely stat-checked and trapped, my guy sighs and agrees just to get the old man to let go. An imagined reflection of his own resigned face flashes before his eyes as he begins to state his request. He casually asks for a winning lottery ticket, but the Santa instantly rejects the fake answer, demanding his true heart's desire. Dropping the tough guy act, our boy's expression turns completely somber. In a memory from 10 years ago, he sat completely alone in a cold, empty funeral hall. A tragedy that left him desperately craving a family that would never leave his side. Standing in the falling snow, our massive hero finally lays his cards on the table, sincerely asking for a loving wife and an adorable daughter. The eccentric Santa takes a massive whiff of the winter air, literally smelling the profound, agonizing loneliness radiating from our boy's soul. A warm smile spreads across the old man's face, absolutely thrilled to have stumbled upon a kindred spirit in the freezing city. But then the vibe shifts from wholesome to straight-up horror movie as the Santa's eyes flare a menacing glowing red, promising to find this guy the absolute perfect family. Thoroughly creeped out by the demonic sudden shift, our guy violently rips his hand free and stumbles back in disgust. Convinced this dude is completely off his rocker, bro turns on his heel and sprints down the snowy street for dear life. The unhinged grandpa just waves from a distance, happily shouting that he's going to use all his magical powers to make the wish a reality. Safely seated on a rattling subway train, the big guy tries to shake off the bizarre encounter as the ramblings of a street crazy. But as the adrenaline fades, a heavy melancholy settles over him, unable to deny the painful truth behind his little confession. Staring blankly at a cheesy transit ad for a happy family, that desperate lifelong yearning claws its way right back to the surface. He lets his heavy eyelids slide shut, wishing for nothing more than a normal, happy life just like everybody else. But when he finally opens them again, the gentle hum of the train is gone, replaced by a freezing pitch-black void that reeks of absolute filth. Our boy groans as he sits up in a dizzy haze, rubbing his pounding head only to realize his winter gear has completely vanished. His eyes snap wide open in absolute panic, because he isn't riding the subway anymore. He's rattling down a dirt road in the back of a horse-drawn cage cart. Stripped down to his boxers and shackled at the ankle, our hero stares out through the iron bars in utter disbelief. The world outside looks like a gritty medieval period piece, complete with a miserable cast of shackled prisoners riding right alongside him. The crunch of heavy footsteps suddenly grabs his attention, putting him on high alert. He spots a pair of armored guards chatting outside the cart, but whatever gibberish they're speaking is completely alien to him. Scanning the haggard slaves, the foreign landscape, and the total lack of modern civilization, the crazy reality finally starts to click. The tall, dark-haired man hasn't just been kidnapped by some weird cult. He's been full-on isekai'd into another world. But before he can even process the genre shift, the freezing air bites at his bare feet, sending violent shivers down his spine. Glancing over, he notices that the gray-haired prisoner slumped against the bars hasn't moved a single inch. Driven by pure survival instinct, my guy quietly apologizes to the corpse as he reaches over to claim the dead man's clothes. Shivering violently, the tall, dark-haired man yanks the dead prisoner's green shirt over his broad shoulders, doing whatever it takes to stave off the biting frost. Dressed in the torn rags, our guy collapses onto the hard wooden floor, the eccentric Santa's ominous promise echoing in his head. Staring up at the ceiling, he desperately wonders if this absolute living hell is the happiness he was promised, praying to just wake up from this nightmare. From there, the days just blur together into a miserable loop as the carriage driver rattles them endlessly down unknown dirt roads. Sitting slumped against the bars, our hero manages to piece together the grim reality of his new isekai life. Taking a heavy, exhausted breath, he realizes the armored guards aren't just hauling them around for fun. He and the other ragged men locked in here are slaves, destined to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. In a memory from days ago, whenever the armored guards lined the shackled captives up outside the cart, village leaders would come by to inspect the merchandise. Even though it completely crushed his pride to accept his new slave status, watching the other men get purchased actually gave our boy a twisted glimmer of hope. Standing tall among the haggard prisoners, my guy figured his massive physique guaranteed he'd be scooped off the market in no time. He genuinely believed his raw physical stats were his golden ticket out of that miserable cage. But few days after being passed over at village after village, that initial spark of optimism has completely rotted away into pure, dead-eyed despair. As the wooden cart rattles endlessly down the dirt path, the sheer weight of his captivity starts to crush him. Our guy finally hits rock bottom, collapsing flat on his back as he wonders if there's even a point in staying alive. In a memory from 20 years ago, young Joan's mother always told him to work hard and endure no matter what life threw at him. Back in the present, staring up at the wooden bars, Joan seriously doubts he has the strength to survive this nightmare. His mind flashes back to that eccentric Santa's manic promise, a supposed wish-granting miracle that now feels like a sick, twisted joke. Cursing the old man and this wretched new world, our hero's trembling fingers hover over a rusty metal fork left on the floorboards. He snatches the makeshift weapon up, deciding that his only real shot at peace is a permanent exit. Driven by pure despair, he swings the sharp prong straight toward his own throat to end the suffering once and for all. But the rusty metal halts mere millimeters from his skin, his survival instinct screaming that he refuses to die in a filthy cage. A vivid vision of the warm, loving family he always wanted flashes behind his eyes, reminding him of his one true wish. Exhausted and trembling, my guy lowers the fork, choosing to endure the hellish reality just a little bit longer. And right on cue, a beautiful blonde woman suddenly approaches the bars, her bright smile cutting through the gloom as she offers him a fresh loaf of bread. She slips the meal through the iron grate, speaking to him in a completely alien language. A second later, a tiny blonde girl with massive yellow eyes timidly peeks out from behind the woman's skirt. The rusty fork clatters to the floorboards as Joan just stares up at them in absolute shock, realizing the eccentric Santa might have actually delivered the exact family he begged for. While our guy is left staring at his sudden gift back at the cages, the comic cuts to a peaceful wooden house deep in the forest. Inside, the brown-haired woman and the blonde child share a quiet, humble meal together. The kid eagerly slurps down her portion of the stew. Sliding her own bowl across the low table, the woman gently tells her to eat up. The little girl innocently protests that she's still hungry, but her caretaker insists she take the extra food. But with surprising empathy, the kid points right back, realizing that Lizzie must be starving too. Touched by the pure consideration, Lizzie flashes a warm smile and agrees. But that wholesome slice-of-life moment is violently shattered when the village chief starts hammering on their door. Lizzie instantly pulls the child into a protective embrace as the chief shouts through the wood, dropping a bombshell. The village has decided to force her into marriage with one of the captive soldiers. Absolute terror drains the color from Lizzie's face as she's ordered to prepare to take the stranger back to the mountain tomorrow. He barks a final demand for her to bring food for the guards at daybreak before wandering off, leaving her completely paralyzed with anxiety. Collapsing to the floor of the darkened room, a suffocating panic sets in as Lizzie is consumed by the terrifying thought of being beaten all over again. Trembling violently, the harsh reality sinks in that she can't just pack up and run away. The little blonde girl presses her face against Lizzie's chest, desperately seeking comfort in the dark. Tears well up in Lizzie's eyes as the crushing realization hits. She can't possibly leave this innocent kid behind to face the nightmare alone. Sensing her protector's distress, the child breaks down into loud, heartbreaking sobs. Lizzie just holds her tight, letting the child cry it out on the floor of the dimly lit room. Sitting alone in the shadows, a suffocating dread washes over Lizzie as she wonders what's going to happen to her now. She pulls her knees to her chest, absolutely terrified of returning to the living hell of her past. Glancing over at the child who has finally cried herself to sleep, Lizzie knows the girl is trapped in the exact same paralyzing fear. It's a tragic, bitter reality for a nameless 5-year-old orphan who has already lost everything. Years ago, her own father sold her off for nothing more than a single rabbit skin. On her very first day at her new husband's dilapidated hut, she was brutally beaten before she could even unpack her bags. The massive man towered over her, striking her without mercy simply because she had arrived a little later than expected. Every sickening thud of the beating cemented the inescapable nightmare of her new reality. Left battered and exhausted on the bare floor, Lizzie felt her spirit completely shatter. But through the darkness, a tiny blonde child hesitantly approached her bruised body. Barely able to move, Lizzie weakly looked up at the little girl. The child stared right back at her with deep, sympathetic golden eyes. In that living hell, this angelic kid was the only one who reached out to offer any comfort. From that day on, the two survived together, clinging to each other, until the abusive husband went into the mountains and never came back. Locals claimed he was eaten by wolves, leaving behind nothing but his bloodied clothes on the forest floor. Hearing the news, Lizzie felt a fleeting wave of relief, instantly swallowed by a crushing sense of dread. She knew all too well that in this harsh world a woman without a husband was as vulnerable as a sheep outside a fence. That was then. Rewind to earlier today. This lingering fear was exactly why Lizzie stayed so guarded when she took the child into the village. As they walked, the little girl excitedly pointed at a commotion in the distance. The kid was pointing straight at the rolling slave carriage hauling the new captives. But the second Lizzie locked eyes with our boy kneeling inside the iron bars, she completely froze up. Sheer, unadulterated terror flooded her wide eyes. Seeing the dark-haired giant clutching that rusty fork triggered a brutal phantom memory. A vision of her late husband violently punching her to the ground. Her entire body trembled as the ghost of her abuser's voice echoed through her skull, dripping with venom. In her mind's eye, she was right back on that cold floor, desperately shielding the blonde child from the towering silhouette of the monster she married. Snapping back to the moment, the imposing reflection of our hero was the only thing she could see. Overcome by a suffocating wave of panic, her grip failed and she dropped her woven basket. And that was the exact split second my guy's hand shot out to catch the falling loaf, cementing their fateful first encounter. Back in the present, the village chief marches right up to the iron cages. He barks orders at the guards, preparing to deal with the newly arrived captives. Joan sits in the garage, still clutching his hard-earned carbs from earlier. But before our guy can even take a single bite of his prize inside the cramped cage, the heavy iron lock suddenly clicks open. 2 armored soldiers aggressively rip the door wide open, screaming at him to get his massive frame outside. He doesn't even get a second to process before one of the guards violently hurls him straight out of the carriage. Our hero crashes hard into the dirt, groaning in pain as his precious life-saving bread tumbles out of reach. The soldiers waste no time, forcing him and 2 other ragged captives onto their knees in a neat little row. Without a single word of warning, a guard whips out a blade and brutally slashes the prisoner's arms open. As the captives tremble and bleed out in the dirt, the soldier casually smears their fresh blood right onto a piece of parchment. Instantly, the stained documents flare up with a blinding blue aura, locking them into some kind of twisted magical contract. Exhausted, bleeding, and completely out of his depth, Joan pants heavily, desperately wondering what kind of insane fantasy world he's been dragged into. Off to the side, a hooded soldier leans in and whispers to the village chief in some unrecognizable guttural language. The gray-haired elder nods and steps forward, looming ominously over our kneeling protagonist. Joan just stares blankly up at the old man, completely bewildered by whatever the hell is about to happen next. A short time later, a gentle breeze rustles through the trees outside Lizzie's quiet wooden house. Inside, a tied sack of meager supplies sits waiting on the floorboards. An older village woman sternly informs Lizzie that her new husband doesn't speak a word of their language, making sure to add that every scrap of these provisions will have to be paid back. The elder doesn't mince words, bluntly admitting that the only reason the village ever put up with Lizzie's late husband was because they desperately needed a mountain keeper. But she promises that this new man is a different breed entirely, as an image of a towering, muscular commoner takes shape in Lizzie's anxious mind. She insists that while he might look like an absolute unit, the soldiers claim his hands are as soft as a pampered noble's. Grabbing Lizzie's hands, the older woman tries to offer some comfort, promising that those soft palms have never struck a soul and that if he's a decent hunter, they'll finally live well. But Lizzie just stares at the floor, the melancholy heavy in her voice as she admits she couldn't care less about living comfortably. The trauma of her past still clawing at her, she quietly prays that this stranger just isn't violent. Gently patting her sleeping daughter, she whispers that if he just leaves the 2 of them alone, it will be more than enough. Suddenly, a heavy fist hammers against the wooden door, a gruff voice demanding they open up immediately. Lizzie flinches hard, her heart hammering against her ribs as she instinctively pulls the sleeping blonde child closer. Through the frosted window pane, the village chief waits impatiently alongside a massive looming silhouette. The wooden door swings wide, and the old man steps inside, loudly announcing that he's finally brought her new husband. Those cruel words hit Lizzie hard, leaving her stammering in absolute shock as the reality of the moment crashes down on her. Our boy steps heavily over the threshold, looking around the small room in utter confusion as he wonders where the hell they've dragged him now. Lizzie and the blonde child can only stare up at him, utterly paralyzed by the sight of this battle-scarred behemoth. Sinking dread pools in her stomach as the horrifying realization sets in. This massive brute is the stranger she's being forced to wed. A cold sweat breaks out across her face, her entire body trembling as she's completely overwhelmed by his suffocating size. Meanwhile, our guy just stares down at the floorboards, still trying to process the absolute whiplash of his new reality. But the moment his eyes land on the cowering woman, it clicks. He immediately recognizes her as the kind stranger who offered him bread at the cage. He watches her violently shaking in the corner, genuinely baffled as to what could possibly have her so terrified. Before he can even try to ask, the village chief reaches up and firmly grabs his arm. With a heavy tug, the old man forcefully yanks our hero forward, dragging him right up to his terrified new bride. The village chief isn't having the hesitation, giving the giant a firm shove forward that sends the blonde child scrambling behind Lizzie's skirt. The old man barks at our boy to loosen up since it's his wedding day, yanking his wrist with surprising force. With a decisive smack, the chief slaps Joanne's massive hand right onto Lizzie's trembling arm. Standing there, linked arm in arm, my guy is completely lost in translation, but even he can read the suffocatingly awkward tension in the room. He turns his head to look down at the petrified woman beside him, and suddenly, the puzzle pieces start snapping together. A vision of that demonic Santa flashes behind his eyes, echoing that fateful promise of a wife with a heart as pure as snow and a lovely daughter. Except looking at Lizzie, he doesn't see a pristine bride. His mind overlays her with the image of a terrified, rabbit-like victim waiting for the axe to fall. And glancing at the kid, he pictures a scared little mongoose desperately hiding from a predator. Staring down at his trembling new family, the realization washes over Joanne that eccentric Santa actually granted his wish, just in the most twisted monkey's paw way imaginable. Even so, our guy can't help but think that isekaiing him to a whole new dimension was a massive overreaction just to grant a wish. The phantom ache of his brutal captivity flares up in his mind, reminding him of the sheer hell he endured to get here. His expression darkens with a murderous red aura as he makes a silent vow. If he ever crosses paths with that twisted Santa again, he's going to end him. Unfortunately, his absolute unit of a murder aura is leaking, leaving Lizzie and the blonde child vibrating out of their skin in pure chibi-level terror. Before our hero can dial back the accidental boss music, 3 local men roll up on the dirt path, spitting absolute alien gibberish. Joanne groans internally, his brain already short-circuiting as he tries to decipher the massive language barrier. The gray-haired village chief just scoffs, whipping his head away in complete frustration. But the blonde local decides to step up to the plate, closing the gap and pressing a hand right against Joanne's chest. The local slides his hand down, grabbing Joanne's palm to initiate a standard-looking handshake, only to instantly clamp down with a bone-crushing death grip. The blonde man strains and sweats bullets trying to establish dominance, while our boy just stares down at him with a completely deadpan expression, taking 0 damage. Joanne just narrows his eyes, genuinely wondering if trying to shatter a guy's metacarpals is just the local meta for saying hello. Deciding to return the favor, the giant simply squeezes back, instantly dropping the local to his knees in absolute bone-grinding agony. The village chief immediately rushes over in a panic, frantically rubbing his hands together in apology as the blonde man screams his lungs out. Stepping right past the whimpering man, the elder addresses our boy directly, trying to de-escalate the situation. He holds out his wooden bow and a single arrow, and presses the weapons right into Joanne's massive hands, leaving the guy completely baffled as to why he's suddenly being armed. Seeing the confusion, the chief drops into a squat and puts his hands up to his head like a pair of floppy ears. He literally starts hopping around the dirt path, putting on a full-blown pantomime of a rabbit. The bizarre game of charades finally clicks in our hero's brain. The old man wants to teach him how to hunt. Suddenly the chief whips around, his eyes going wide. He frantically taps Joanne's chest, pointing an urgent finger straight into the nearby brush. Sure enough, a plump white rabbit is sitting right there in the open, happily munching on some leaves. The elder starts urgently gesturing for him to take the shot, sending my guy into a mild panic since he has literally never held a bow in his entire life. My guy awkwardly draws the string back, sweating bullets since his archery experience is literally non-existent. Sending it with a silent prayer, he lets the arrow fly. It slices through the air, catching the poor rabbit completely off guard. Beside him, the village chief claps enthusiastically, while Joanne just stares at his own hands, absolutely flabbergasted that his beginner's luck actually paid off. But their little victory lap is cut short by the crunch of approaching footsteps. Our hero looks up to see an older woman leading Lizzie and the blonde child right toward them. He swallows hard, his nerves suddenly spiking. Watching Lizzie step closer, the heavy reality finally sets in. This deeply traumatized woman is his actual bride. Instantly, the big guy starts blushing furiously, leaving the chief thoroughly confused by the giant's sudden shy streak. A short while later, the newly formed trio is sitting awkwardly on a picnic blanket in the middle of the woods. Lizzie offers a polite little bow as she sets out a modest meal. Joan eats in silence, catching Lizzie's gentle smile while the kid just locks onto him with an intense, unblinking stare. But the second he shifts his weight, Lizzie and the child flinch back in sheer terror. Our guy just pauses, quietly processing the deep-seated fear still radiating from them. Hoping to ease their nerves, he softens his rugged features into a gentle, reassuring smile. Taking in the peaceful scene, he reflects on the cold reality of his past. How from middle school all the way into his 30s, waking up alone was just his daily routine. Now against all odds he actually has a family of his own, even if they're currently watching him like a live grenade. He grips his wooden bowl, accepting that while the demonic matchmaking was brutal, the end result is exactly what he wished for. Staring up at the sunlit sky, Bro admits to himself that while he still fully intends to murder Santa, he's also undeniably grateful. The next day, the village chief leads the group deeper into the woods to resume their journey. Hauling a massive sack of supplies like it weighs nothing, our hero throws a quick glance over his shoulder. He immediately spots Lizzie and the blonde child panting heavily, completely drained by the grueling hike. My guy groans in pure frustration, hating the fact that the language barrier means he can't even ask if they need a breather. He turns his focus forward, determined to speedrun his adaptation to this brutal new reality. In a flashback to 20 years ago, his mother told a young Joan that when he wanted to protect someone, he couldn't afford to hesitate. Flashing a gentle smile, she insisted that true protection required immediate action. Back in the present, our boy stops dead in his tracks, taking those words straight to heart. He spins around and marches right back to his exhausted companions, completely startling them. The blonde child looks up at the towering figure with wide, tearful eyes, whimpering in absolute terror. Dropping to one knee to lower his massive aggro radius, Joan gently tells them not to be afraid because he's going to carry them. Lizzie just clutches her chest, completely shell-shocked by his sudden approach. Totally misreading the situation, she drops to the dirt and starts desperately pleading in her alien tongue. The little girl instantly bursts into tears, shrinking away from the terrifying stranger. Our hero groans internally, realizing his intense resting face is only making the whole vibe infinitely worse. Deciding to just rip the band-aid off, he politely excuses himself and reaches out. He scoops up the blonde child first, lifting her like she weighs absolutely nothing. Then he grabs Lizzie, pulling her right up alongside the kid. In one smooth, effortless motion, the giant rises to his feet. He hoists them both into his arms like it's a casual Tuesday, leaving his new bride completely stunned by the sheer stat check of his strength. The little girl babbles something in her alien language, her previous terror instantly evaporating into pure awe. Joan just gives Lizzie a reassuring look and tells her to hold on tight. As he starts trekking through the woods, a grim realization hits him. Even carrying all their gear, his new family weighs practically nothing. It absolutely breaks our hero's heart, cementing his vow to master this world's language and hunt down enough meat to finally feed them properly. He knows he's got a massive grind ahead of him, but feeling Lizzie's quiet, affectionate gaze resting on him makes every step worth it. Eventually, the physical exertion catches up, and a single bead of sweat rolls down his neck. Without a second thought, Lizzie gently reaches out and dabs it away. The sudden, tender contact makes my guy flinch, stopping him dead in his tracks. Embarrassed by her own boldness, Lizzie instantly retracts her hand, clutching it to her chest like she just touched a hot stove. Shaking off the brief system error in his brain, our hero adjusts his massive payload and resumes trailing the village chief through the woods. They finally hit their destination, a rustic little wooden cabin, and Joan respectfully bows to thank their guide for the escort mission. The gray-haired elder returns the gesture before vanishing back into the tree line like an NPC whose quest is complete. Staring up at his new base of operations, Joan immediately starts sweating the insulation stats, dreading that it's going to be an absolute icebox inside. A phantom chill violently spikes down his spine as a traumatic vision of being chained barefoot in the freezing snow flashes before his eyes. Forcing the mental pop-up to close, my guy reaches out and grips the heavy wooden door. He pushes it open, fully expecting a dusty, empty room, but immediately freezes in his tracks. Lizzie is already standing inside the dimly lit cabin, and she's absolutely streaming tears. He gently asks her what's wrong, but she just flinches in absolute silence. Before he can even attempt a charisma check, she completely books it, bolting right past his massive frame and out the front door. Left standing in the doorway, our boy turns around, completely and utterly bewildered by the sudden exit. The giant just stares into the barren room, his brain buffering as he tries to process the sudden hit and run. Meanwhile, deep in the woods, Lizzie is having a total breakdown, sobbing into her knees because the village completely stripped their home bare while they were gone. The panic sets in as she realizes winter is right around the corner, and without a single tool or weapon, they're basically sitting ducks for the local wildlife. But her doom spiral is cut short when Jo-won steps into the clearing, having easily tracked her through the brush. Without a single word, the big guy just drops down onto the grass right beside her. Reaching out, he gently rests his massive hand right on top of her head, startling her out of her tears. He softly tells her not to sweat it, and even though the language barrier is still up, the comforting head pats translate perfectly. Blushing through her tears, Lizzie looks up at him, finally accepting that this gentle giant is the man she's bound to for life. Still, the anxiety creeps right back in. How are they supposed to survive out here when her new protector doesn't even know the first thing about hunting? She stares up at him with incredibly vulnerable eyes, silently pleading to know if they actually have a shot at surviving this frozen hellscape. Meeting her gaze, our boy flashes a warm, confident smile, making an absolute unbreakable vow to protect her no matter what. Tears spill down Lizzie's cheeks as the crushing weight of her anxiety finally bubbles to the surface. But the moment our hero gently wipes them away, a strange, unfamiliar relief washes over her. While our boy confesses that he's been entirely alone since the day his parents passed away. Despite everything this brutal world threw at him, he fought tooth and nail just to survive. And now that he finally has a family to call her own, he knows he can make it through anything. Jo-won flashes a confident smile and thumps his chest, silently promising to provide for her no matter what it takes. But the tender moment shatters when Lizzie suddenly clutches her chest with a sharp gasp. All her remaining strength gives out and she collapses right into my guy's lap with a pained groan. Spotting the sudden drop from afar, the little blonde girl sprints across the grass in an absolute panic. She throws her tiny arms around Lizzie, screaming at the towering giant not to hurt her. Jo-won just blinks in stunned silence, completely taken aback by this fierce little protector. Looking down at the fragile, weeping woman in his arms, the sheer weight of his new reality finally starts to sink in. Along with the terrified child clinging to his sleeve. His mind races, trying to piece together who this kid is and why this woman showed him such kindness back when he was rotting in a cage. But as our hero pulls them both into a warm, protective embrace, he makes a silent, ironclad vow to never let either of them shed a tear again. He's going to step up and be the absolute unit of a father and husband they deserve. Fast forward to later that day, back inside their cozy wooden cabin, where the atmosphere is thick with absolute suffocating awkwardness. Jo-won fidgets on the floorboards, realizing that despite their emotional breakthrough, they are right back to square one. At least they aren't looking at him like a terrifying raid boss anymore, but my guy has zero clue how to actually break the ice. Suddenly, a massive light bulb goes off in his head. He scoots across the room at lightning speed, nearly giving the girls a heart attack. Pointing a massive thumb right at his chest, he loudly declares his name, Kim Jo-won. He sounds it out syllable by syllable, explaining that if they're going to survive under one roof, they at least need to know what to call each other. The big guy pauses, letting the syllables hang in the air to see if the message actually landed. Gently extending a massive hand toward Lizzie, he asks for her name in return. She hesitates, timidly mumbling something completely inaudible under her breath. But then she taps her own chest, finally speaking up clearly enough for him to catch a single word. Lizzie. Our hero flashes a warm smile, complimenting the pretty name, even if the language barrier keeps her totally silent. Pivoting his attention to the little blonde kid, he gently asks what she goes by. The girl nervously glances up at Lizzie, and the cozy mood instantly flatlines into a heavy, awkward silence. Shaking her head with a heartbreaking little pout, she reveals the tragic truth. She doesn't even have one. Seeing the kid look so utterly defeated shatters my guy's heart into a million pieces. Reaching out to gently pat her hair, he decides right then and there to fix that. A whimsical fairy tale flashes in his mind's eye as he officially dubs her Dorothy. He pictures a bright imagined future where she goes on grand adventures with friends, just like the brave heroine from The Wizard of Oz. He envisions a beautiful storybook future where she grows up surrounded by friends, embarking on wonderful adventures. Back in reality, the little girl's eyes sparkle as she sounds out her brand new name, absolutely loving the ring of it. As the sun starts to set, our boy gets right to work splitting firewood outside the cabin. Meanwhile, Lizzie peeks out from behind a tree, quietly observing this absolute unit of a man and finding him completely baffling. His massive hands could easily snap a person in half, yet he only uses that terrifying strength for hard labor and gentle head pats. It's a total mind trip for her, because he is absolutely nothing like the cruel, violent men she's known. Hiding in the shadows, she quietly sounds out his name, finding a weird sense of comfort in his refined, gentle voice despite the massive language barrier. Years ago, her life was a nightmare of abuse and neglect, treated like worthless garbage by the men who were supposed to protect her. Back in the present, she watches his warm expression, completely stumped as to why this towering stranger is treating her with such genuine kindness. Mid-swing, Jo-won pauses his lumberjack routine, finally noticing his wife playing hide-and-seek behind the timber. Our guy immediately drops the tough guy aura, flashing a massive golden retriever smile and cheerfully calling out her name. Lizzie's eyes go wide in shock as she suddenly zeroes in on his incredibly rare features. Pitch black hair and striking dark eyes. In her mind's eye she pictures the wild tavern gossip. Rumors that an enemy nation actually pulled off a legendary hero summoning ritual. The imagined silhouette of this mythical savior always featured the exact same ultra-rare specs, pitch black hair and bottomless black eyes. Snapping back to reality, she scrutinizes every heavy step our guy takes as he closes the distance between them. Staring into his dark pupils, she realizes he completely fits the physical description of that ultimate overpowered protagonist. But she quickly shuts that theory down, reasoning that a legendary savior would be living it up in a grand palace, not playing lumberjack in a freezing middle-of-nowhere forest. Besides, those campfire stories are probably just exaggerated hype anyway. The towering giant steps right into her personal space, his massive frame completely eclipsing her small figure. Peering up at him, Lizzie realizes the lighting was playing tricks on her. His hair is actually a deep dark brown, not pitch black. She lets out a massive sigh of relief, glad that he's just a normal, albeit absolute unit of a man. But then her brain short-circuits, suddenly wondering why she's so emotionally invested in a complete stranger she literally just met. She comically shakes her head to reboot her confusing thoughts, leaving our hero utterly bewildered by her sudden glitching. Chuckling at her flustered panic, my guy reaches out and gently pats her on the head, completely catching her off guard. Lizzie instantly freezes, the sudden contact violently ripping her back to the dark trauma of her past. Because until now, a man's hand on her head only ever meant one thing. A brutal beating was about to follow. But Joan's touch is so impossibly warm and tender that her anxiety simply melts away, her eyes fluttering shut. Yielding to the gentle affection, she leans into his massive hand, desperately yearning for the comforting warmth to last. Meanwhile, my guy's heart starts hammering a frantic beat against his ribs as the beautiful woman presses herself against his chest. Looking up, Lizzie gazes at him with half-closed, undeniably affectionate eyes. And our boy completely short-circuits, acting on pure instinct as he leans down and plants a kiss right on her lips. Caught completely off guard, Lizzie's eyes snap wide open in pure unadulterated shock. A split second later, the romantic fog clears, and Joan's brain finally registers exactly what he just did. He violently jumps back like he just touched a live wire, while Lizzie stands absolutely petrified, comically frozen solid like a block of ice. His face burning brighter than a stop sign, our hero stammers helplessly, completely failing to form a single coherent apology. Unable to handle the sheer, crushing awkwardness of the moment, Bro abruptly spins around and snatches up a wooden water bucket. He white-knuckles that handle like it's the last chopper out of a war zone. And then my guy absolutely books it, sprinting into the tree line like he's trying to break the sound barrier. Lizzie is left standing completely alone, clutching her racing heart as her face practically steams like a boiling kettle. Deep in the woods, Joan does the ultimate walk of shame, violently cringing at his own zero IQ play. He aggressively scratches his head, agonizing over the tiny detail that they technically just met today. Thanks to the language barrier, our boy has zero clue how to smooth this over, debating if he should just hit the reset button and pretend the whole thing was a glitch. But mid-panic attack, his heavy boots suddenly grind to a dead halt in the dirt. He scans the dense, unfamiliar timber, the horrifying realization dropping that his little tactical retreat just got him hopelessly lost. The wind starts howling through the dark canopy, instantly shifting the vibe from rom-com to survival horror. Figuring he should just grab some water and backtrack, he freezes the second something heavy rustles in the brush behind him. A cold sweat spikes down his spine as every survival instinct in his body screams that he's being watched. Emerging from the pitch-black shadows is a massive nightmare-fuel wolf, its glowing red eyes locking dead onto its next meal. The beast peels back its lips to bear a row of razor-sharp fangs, dropping a low, guttural snarl that practically vibrates through the trees. For the first time since arriving in this nightmare world, our guy is completely paralyzed, his massive frame trembling like a leaf before a true apex predator. Joan might be a towering giant back in the village, but staring up at the sheer, overwhelming scale of this monster, the horrifying reality sets in. Out here in the deep woods, he is nothing but prey. Crouched in the underbrush, our guy is absolutely paralyzed with fear, his massive frame trembling as a sinister rustle closes in. But survival instinct takes the wheel, and my guy white-knuckles the only weapon he's got. A sturdy wooden branch. Planting his feet, our hero lets out a defiant roar of his own, matching the towering beast's terrifying snarl decibel for decibel. The monster lunges, clamping its massive jaws onto the wood as our guy desperately strains to hold the line. Refusing to end up as dog food, Joan cranks his free arm back and rips an absolute war cry from his chest. Instead of backing down, our boy steps into the pocket and feeds the beast a heavy right hook straight to the snout. But the beast just eats the hit, clamping its massive jaws down until my guy's makeshift weapon starts splintering like a cheap toothpick. Screaming that he absolutely refuses to get packed up in some random forest, our boy throws a desperate bare-knuckle hook straight into the monster's neck. Roaring that he isn't dying today, Joan winds up for one last desperate strike as his right eye suddenly flares with a blinding blue light. But before our guy can even swing, the giant wolf's jaws snap shut, instantly obliterating his hand. But just as he's left completely defenseless, an agonizing heat erupts from deep inside our hero, tearing a blood-curdling scream from his throat as it feels like his very veins have caught fire. But before the monster can finish the job, a blinding flash suddenly illuminates the dark woods, drawing a startled yelp from the giant wolf as Joan's eyes widen in pure shock. Just as he thinks it's all over, our boy stares in absolute bewilderment as his left arm spontaneously bursts into roaring intense flames. The giant beast recoils from the sudden heat, leaving Joan to gawk at the inferno raging across his own skin. Realizing this is his only chance, my guy doesn't hesitate, leaping forward and mounting the disoriented monster. With his arms still blazing, he unleashes a brutal explosive barrage of flaming punches, pummeling the roaring beast into submission. Moments later, the nightmare wolf lies dead in the dirt, smoke rising from its battered, scorched carcass. Collapsing onto the grass, our hero gasps for air, his mind racing to process the impossible fiery phenomenon he just witnessed. He inspects his arm, completely baffled to find his skin and clothes entirely untouched by the roaring flames. Sitting up, a startling realization hits him like a freight train. He just used actual magic. His mind immediately jumps to the classic fantasy novels he used to read, visualizing a scene of armored guards and bound prisoners as he pictures the trope where ordinary guys get transported to another world and unlock overpowered abilities. Staring at his palm, a spark of hope ignites in his chest as he wonders if he can cast it on command. Bro dramatically thrusts his hand toward the sky, enthusiastically screaming out the name of a classic fire spell. He shouts the spell again and again, but is met with nothing but awkward, deafening silence. Our guy completely loses his dignity, just screaming out every fire-related attack name he can pull from his gamer memory. He begs the spirits of the earth and fire fairies for a crumb of mana, but the dead giant wolf remains his only thoroughly unimpressed audience. The sheer cringe finally washes over him, and he gives up, feeling like an absolute clown for screaming at a mangled corpse. But staring down at his palms, the realization hits that the magic was absolutely real. It even patched up his minor scrapes. And if he can actually master this cheat skill, he'll be the ultimate provider. A heartwarming vision flashes in his mind of a cozy, prosperous future, picturing himself serving endless feasts and comfort for Lizzie and little Dorothy. Out here in these remote, freezing mountains without a single doctor in sight, unlocking healing magic could literally be the difference between life and death for his new family. Throwing an arm over his eyes to block out the sky, our hero calms his racing heart, resolving to figure out this power methodically instead of just mashing buttons. Years ago, his world was a much darker place, as he stood at the somber funeral of the grandfather who had taken him in after his parents passed. That day, a grieving older relative violently punched the teenager right in the face, sending him crashing backward. The man stood over the fallen boy, viciously screaming that his family was dead simply because they shared a roof with Joan. Surrounded by the glaring, shadowy faces of his extended relatives, the middle schooler was treated like a cursed plague that brought nothing but death to anyone who loved him. Back in the present, Joan's expression darkens as he silently bears the suffocating weight of those traumatic memories. Shaking off the heavy memories, our guy decides to skip draining the carcass's blood for now so he doesn't invite every predator in the forest to a free buffet. He effortlessly hoists the massive beast onto his broad shoulders, knowing he needs to hustle back before Lizzie assumes the worst. Trekking through the dark woods, he realizes all those childhood hours spent watching his late grandfather butcher chickens are about to pay off in a major way. Walking beneath the pale moonlight, Joan finds a quiet sliver of peace in knowing the old man would be incredibly proud of his survival skills. But as he makes the long trek home, one pressing question keeps nagging at him. How exactly is he supposed to level up this mysterious new fire magic? Meanwhile, back at the rustic cabin, Lizzie and Dorothy are busy keeping the hearth warm. The little blonde girl happily scurries over, eagerly holding up a wooden bowl to help with the evening chores. Lizzie accepts it with a warm smile, affectionately patting the kid's head and calling her by the very name Joan gave her, Dorothy. Dorothy absolutely beams at the gentle praise, the trauma of her past momentarily melting away in the warmth of their cozy new home. Full of boundless energy, the little girl runs around the cabin, her curiosity piqued by every shadow and corner. But when a sudden heavy rustling echoes from the tree line, she climbs up to peek through the small wooden window. Her golden eyes widen in sheer confusion as she spots a massive, terrifying dark shape moving through the trees outside. Suddenly, the horrifying visage of that giant gray wolf slams right up against the glass. Dorothy lets out a blood-curdling shriek, sending Lizzie whipping around in sheer panic. Mama Bear instincts engage instantly as Lizzie snatches a massive kitchen knife right off the table. Screaming for the kid to get back, she sprints toward the door, fully prepared to fight this monster to the bitter end. But as she reaches the threshold, her eyes widen in absolute shock at the scene unfolding outside. It isn't a wild beast attacking the cabin. It's our boy Joan, looking ready to pass out while casually hauling the massive dead wolf on his shoulders. Still running on pure adrenaline, Lizzie bursts out into the yard with her weapon raised, screaming Joan's name in absolute terror. Hearing his name, my guy finally lets the heavy carcass drop to the grass with a heavy thud, panting like he just ran a marathon. He looks up in total bewilderment as his new family charges at him, completely confused by their frantic panic. Lizzie freezes dead in her tracks, tears welling up as the realization finally hits her that the terrifying beast is already a corpse. The heavy blade slips from her trembling fingers, clattering harmlessly onto the dirt. The emotional dam breaks as she collapses to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, while frantically touching our hero's face just to make sure he's actually alive. Dorothy drops down right beside her, clinging to our guy's leg and crying her little eyes out. Smiling gently, Joan takes Lizzie's trembling hand, softly reassuring her that it's just a minor scratch. Leaning back against the massive carcass, our boy pats both of them on the back, letting them know the danger is finally over. Overcome with emotion, Lizzie suddenly throws her arms around his neck, pulling him into a desperate tight embrace. As she cries into his shoulder, this guy tries to piece together her foreign words, guessing her sheer relief from her tone alone. Hearing Dorothy make the same distressed sounds, he realizes just how terrified they were of losing him. Wrapping his massive arms around his new family, my guy feels a sharp pang of guilt, having sworn to himself he would never make them cry again. The long, terrifying night finally gives way to a peaceful morning, as the sun rises over the remote mountain cabin. Outside, Joan is already hard at work, using a small knife to butcher the massive wolf on a wooden table. He wipes the sweat from his brow, realizing that skinning an oversized monster is a whole lot harder than his grandfather made it look. Exhausted and covered in grime, our hero admits he's going to need a better method if he plans on doing this on the regular. Just as he finishes slicing the last cut of meat, a soft voice calls out his name from the cabin. Suddenly, a familiar silhouette steps out into the crisp morning light. Our guy's tired expression instantly brightens the second he recognizes Lizzie walking toward him. He happily steps out of his makeshift workspace to greet her, noticing she's lugging a heavy wooden bucket. She sets it down on the grass right in front of him, gesturing toward the towering pile of fresh cuts. It takes Joan a second to process, but it clicks. She brought the bucket to help him haul the meat inside. Touched by the gesture, Bro racks his brain, desperately trying to pull up the local vocabulary for gratitude. Sweating bullets, he stumbles through the unfamiliar syllables, awkwardly muttering a broken attempt at a thank you. Lizzie blinks in surprise before a warm, genuinely amused smile spreads across her face. My guy instantly panics, terrified he just accidentally dropped a massive insult in her native tongue. But Lizzie just giggles, playfully repeating his butchered pronunciation with a teasing twinkle in her eye. Washing away the nerves, Joan takes a confident step closer to the woman he swore to protect. Looking down at her with a gentle, sincere smile, he nails the delivery this time, proving that their bond is growing stronger with every single day. Joan's simple expression of gratitude leaves Lizzie completely speechless. As our guy turns away to get back to work, the realization hits her that she's never once been thanked by her own blood relatives. All she did was hand him a bucket of water, yet with him she kept experiencing so many wonderful firsts. Snapping back to the present, our hero walks ahead while Lizzie turns beet red, her mind jumping straight to their first kiss. The sheer embarrassment of her own romantic thoughts has her whole face burning up. Despite the flustered panic, her curiosity wins out, and she hurries after him toward the cabin. But the butterflies quickly sour into a heavy knot of insecurity, as the poor girl wonders if he's kissed other women before and if they felt this exact same way. Inside, she's startled out of her spiral when my guy suddenly sets the bucket down. Snapping into action, Lizzie rushes to the table to take over the meat prep, convinced that these chores are strictly a woman's job. She swiftly takes over the task, completely baffled as to why this absolute unit of a man naturally assumes the burden of the housework. They end up in a sudden standoff, both freezing in place with raw meat in hand as they stare awkwardly at each other. And when our boy leans in close, Lizzie's heart skips a beat, her nervous mind instantly convinced he's going in for round two. She squeezes her eyes shut, bracing herself for the ultimate romantic payoff. But our guy completely subverts expectations, dropping a gentle, wholesome peck right on her forehead instead. Lizzie practically recoils, her brain short-circuiting as she realizes she completely misread the room. A heavy, awkward silence settles over the kitchen as Joan quietly scoops up the bucket, leaving her to stew in her own embarrassment. In her mind's eye, a tiny version of herself is absolutely tearing her hair out, agonizing over how incredibly desperate she must have looked. But before she can fully spiral, the dark-haired giant suddenly leans right back into her personal space. This time she is dead set on keeping her eyes wide open, refusing to let herself look like a fool twice in one day. And that is exactly when our hero goes in for the real deal, planting a genuine heart-stopping kiss right on her lips while she stands there completely paralyzed. He pulls back with a soft, devastatingly warm smile, leaving the poor woman entirely rebooting her operating system. Joan turns to casually walk off with the meat bucket like he didn't just drop a romantic nuke, only to stop dead in his tracks when he spots a tiny spectator. Little Dorothy is peeking right around the doorframe, sending Lizzie into a full-blown internal panic as she realizes the kid had a front row seat to the whole show. Unable to handle this critical level of embarrassment, Lizzie hits the eject button and absolutely sprints away, leaving Joanne and Dorothy completely bewildered. The big guy and the little girl just stand there in the yard, silently watching Lizzie make her hasty, flustered retreat. A gentle tug on his pant leg snaps our boy back to reality. He looks down at Dorothy with a warm, lingering smile, still riding the high of that moment, and gives her a soft thanks. But the kid hits him with a weapons-grade pout, leaving him scrambling to figure out what he did wrong. Until it clicks. Shifting the heavy bucket of meat so she can grab the side, he makes sure to deliberately thank her by name. And just like that, the pout vanishes, replaced by a massive beaming smile as she eagerly nods along. Back inside the cabin, Lizzie has cooled off enough to focus on her chores, gently stroking the massive, terrifying wolf pelt like it's a giant, albeit dead puppy. Joanne chills on the floor nearby, mildly baffled as to why she's drying something that smells like a wet, demonic dog right in the middle of the living room. Watching her carefully smooth out the fur, the realization hits him. This monstrous trophy is incredibly precious to her because it's tangible proof that they're safe. Suddenly, Dorothy plops down right next to Lizzie, her big golden eyes locked onto the terrifying beast's face. Without an ounce of fear, the kid reaches out and gives the giant deadly snout a playful little boop. The sheer absurdity of it gets Lizzie giggling, and soon both of them are laughing together. A picture-perfect moment of peace that our hero gets to quietly soak in. Our guy can't help but smile, his heart completely melting at the sight of his new family actually looking happy. Outside, their little rustic cabin sits peacefully nestled in the lush green forest. Inside, Lizzie gets right down to business, tossing massive slabs of raw wolf meat into a wooden bowl. Joanne watches her every move like a hawk, mentally taking notes on how she cures the cut so he can take over the chore next time. He notes how thrilled she is to have the extra animal fat, quietly patting himself on the back for having the foresight to save it. But watching her hustle sparks a fire in our hero. There is still way too much he doesn't know about surviving in this medieval world. Glancing at the massive black pelt, he realizes he needs a crash course in local economics, from figuring out what counts as currency to mastering the art of the trade. Deciding his break time is officially over, Bro hypes himself up to get back to the grind. He pops up to his feet so fast that he completely startles Lizzie right out of her zone. She spins around in a panic, completely misunderstanding his sudden movement and asking if he needs her to stay put. The big guy just chuckles and shakes his head, reassuring her that he's rested up and the pain is totally gone. Gently resting a massive hand on her shoulder, Joanne promises he won't push his limits, comforting her with a warm, gentle smile. Leaving Lizzie to her indoor chores, our hero steps outside to pull his own weight around here. He spots a massive tree in the sunlit forest, figuring it's the perfect target dummy for a little lumberjack practice. Staring into the reflection of the axe blade, Bro admits he doesn't know an oak from a pine, but with his maxed out strength stats, how hard could it be? Channeling every ounce of his power, he winds up for a devastating, earth-shattering strike. Gripping the handle tight enough to leave fingerprints in the wood, my guy unleashes a swing that could probably cleave a mountain. And he completely whiffs it, letting the weapon slip right out of his hands to land pathetically in the grass. Standing there in absolute silence, the big guy just scratches his head, sweating buckets over the sheer embarrassment of that critical miss. After somehow managing to scrape together a decent haul, our boy trudges back to their peaceful little cabin. Pushing the rustic door open, he steps inside with a heavy basket of freshly chopped firewood strapped to his back. Across the room, Lizzie and Dorothy both snap their heads up, totally startled by his sudden entrance. Before he can even set his cargo down, Lizzie closes the distance in a flash and urgently grabs his hand. With surprising force, she yanks him right down to the floor, leaving Joanne sitting in a pile of spilled wood with a massive question mark floating over his head. He quickly waves off her panic, assuring her that he's perfectly fine. Flashing a warm smile, he thanks her for worrying, while little Dorothy quietly observes the exchange. Without warning, the blonde girl turns on her heel and dashes across the room. She makes a beeline for a wooden basin, plunging her tiny hands straight into the water. Leaving a trail of droplets in her wake, she scurries right back to our hero. With a playful shout, Dorothy slaps her soaking wet hands onto his chest, catching both adults completely off guard. My guy just stares down in absolute bewilderment as the kid grips his soaked shirt. The sheer absurdity of the moment breaks the tension, and Lizzie lets out a genuine heartwarming laugh. Looking down into Dorothy's wide sparkling eyes, a sudden wave of emotion hits Joanne. He gently pats the little girl on the head, softly thanking her for the sweet gesture. But Dorothy is just getting started, instantly sprinting back for a second round while our boy frantically tries to call a timeout. As Lizzie completely loses it, giggling beside an exasperated Joanne, he can't help but feel like this entire beautiful chaotic moment is nothing but a dream. Just a few days ago, he thought his life was over. But with Lizzie leaning happily against him, Joanne silently vows to do whatever it takes to protect these smiles. As the sun dips below the horizon, the chaotic energy of the day finally gives way to a peaceful, quiet night. Inside the cabin, the makeshift family gathers around the low table to share a warm, well-deserved dinner. But halfway through the meal, the two adults suddenly pause, their attention caught by a quiet shift in the room. Little Dorothy has completely crashed out mid-bite, her breathing soft and steady as she dozes right there on the floor. The pair share a fond, quiet chuckle at the absolutely adorable sight. Moving with surprising gentleness for a guy his size, our hero scoops the exhausted kiddo up into his arms. He carries her across the fire-lit room, savoring the domestic peace he's always desperately wanted. With the utmost care, he tucks Dorothy into bed, making sure the tiny warrior gets her rest. Outside, the forest is completely still, the cabin radiating a cozy, flickering warmth into the dark. Back near the stove, Lizzie is busy wringing out a steaming hot cloth, the day's chores finally winding down. And as Jo-won quietly steps up behind her, the evening shifts into something much more intimate. Without warning, Lizzie reaches out and grabs his wrist. She pulls his hand toward her, holding it tight in both of hers as she looks up at him with a deeply flushed, emotional gaze. Jo-won is completely caught off guard, a faint blush creeping across his face as he stares down at her in surprise. And as the view pulls back into the quiet night, framing their silhouettes through the glowing window, it looks like our boy has finally found exactly what he wished for. Picking up right where we left off, Lizzie clings to our boy's collar, her face flushed red as she gazes up at him. She mentally hypes herself up, resolving to drop the shyness because this is exactly what a wife is supposed to do. Mustering every ounce of her courage, she makes a bold move and slides her hand right under his shirt. Jo-won just stares down in silent surprise as she nervously exposes his stomach. But her newfound confidence shatters in record time, and she yanks her hand back with a groan, realizing she's still way too embarrassed for this. Before she can completely retreat, our hero gently catches her hand with a soft, reassuring smile. Leaning in close, he softly whispers that it's time for them to get some sleep. Hand in hand, a gentle giant leads her back into the dark cabin. Once inside, he flops down right beside her on the floor. Hovering over her, his intense, silent gaze makes Lizzie gulp nervously. He reaches out to gently touch her arm in the quiet darkness. Her face burning bright red, Lizzie lets out a shaky, nervous breath as the tension peaks. But instead of pushing her boundaries, our guy just leans in for a tender kiss, marveling at how incredibly soft she is. Later, as little Dorothy sleeps peacefully, our hero watches over his new family, praying that they outlive him. In a desperate vision flashing through his mind, he mentally begs the twisted Santa who brought him here to never take them away, wanting nothing more than to protect their smiles until his dying breath. But while wealthy nobles might have the luxury of separate rooms and sprawling estates, in a nightmare of years ago, for commoners like Lizzie's family, every child grew up in the exact same cramped space as their parents. And because of that lack of privacy, a young Lizzie couldn't help but know exactly how a couple spent their nights. She cowered under her blanket as Lizzie's father violently beat her mother just feet away. His vicious shouting was always absolutely terrifying, echoing endlessly through the tiny room. Once he finally passed out, she and the brown-haired boy would huddle together, forced to listen to the dark-haired mother's muffled sobs until dawn. The little girl would lie awake in pure despair, terrified that the dark-haired mother's miserable life would one day become her own future. Back in the present, Lizzie's eyes snap open, pulling her out of the traumatic nightmare. The comforting sound of crackling logs grounds her in reality, a warm reminder that she is finally safe. She blinks away the lingering dread, utterly confused to find herself tucked safely into bed between our guy and Dorothy instead of on the cold floor. The surprise deepens when she realizes this absolute unit of a man is gently letting her use his massive arm as a pillow. Glancing down, she spots the little blonde girl sleeping soundly against her side, completely at peace. Snuggling closer to our hero's warmth, a profound wave of relief washes over Lizzie as the realization hits her. The nights between a husband and wife don't have to be a terrifying ordeal. Ever since she met this gentle giant, her entire shattered world has been slowly piecing itself back together for the better. The quiet moment is suddenly interrupted when my guy stirs in his sleep, making her flinch. But instead of waking up angry, he just unconsciously wraps his massive arm around both of them, pulling his new family into a tight, warm embrace. Lizzie's face instantly flushes a brilliant shade of red, her heart hammering so fast against her ribs she thinks it might actually explode. Surrounded by this unfamiliar warmth, she completely melts into the hug, desperately wishing this sweet, tingly feeling could last forever. Moments later, golden sunlight streams through the cabin window as our boy continues to snooze peacefully beside Dorothy. He finally rouses from his slumber and sits up, making sure to gently tuck the blanket around the kid so she stays warm. Meanwhile, Lizzie is already up and fully dressed, heading into the kitchen area with a light step to tackle her daily chores. But before she can lift the heavy water bucket, a massive hand suddenly clamps down on the handle. Our guy effortlessly swipes the chore right out of her grasp, leaving the poor woman blinking in surprise. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tosses the water straight onto the hearth, dousing the leftover embers with a loud, smoky sizzle. Then he turns back to her and casually drops a greeting in his native language. Lizzie just stares back with a massive question mark over her head, completely lost in the sauce of his gibberish. Realizing he forgot to switch his language settings, Jo-won translates, asking if she slept well, but immediately notices her face is turning the color of a stop sign. She gives a tiny shy nod, and the big guy quickly pieces together that his casual husband-tier greeting is what short-circuited her brain. A warm smile spreads across his face as it clicks that she's definitely not used to being hit with sweet terms of endearment. Leaning into the domestic vibes, he gently asks her what she would actually prefer him to call her. Blushing so hard she might actually combust, Lizzie stammers through her embarrassment and shyly requests that he keep using that sweet pet name. Our hero happily obliges, using the pet name one more time and causing Lizzie to let out an adorable squeak as she buries her burning face in her hands. Finding her critical hit level of fluster absolutely precious, Jo-won decides he definitely needs to tease his new wife just a little bit more. My guy playfully taps her shoulder, asking her to look him in the eyes. While Lizzie lets out a muffled whine of pure embarrassment, the comic cuts to Dorothy suddenly shooting straight up in bed. The little blonde girl sits there drooling, her tiny mind completely consumed by a single glorious thought: meat. Driven by pure carnivorous hunger, she scrambles out of bed and speed crawls across the floor like a woman on a mission. Our hero and Lizzie happily call out to the kid as she comes zooming into the room. But Dorothy completely ignores them, blowing right past her totally bewildered parents without a second glance. Her eyes sparkle like literal stars as she locks onto her target, a massive chunk of meat resting on a barrel. She dives for the prize, ending up hilariously stuck headfirst in the barrel while her parents just watch the chaos in total amusement. Even completely upside down, she looks up at her dad and stubbornly demands her breakfast, making Jo-won burst into hearty laughter. She flails her little legs in the air, chanting for meat like it's her absolute lifeline. Smiling fondly at his daughter's ridiculous antics, our boy decides it is officially time to get serious about hunting. Armed with an axe, he marches right into the sunlit forest, fully ready to throw down with another giant wolf if it means keeping his family fed. He hefts his axe, feeling a whole lot more confident now that he's actually packing a reliable weapon. But as he ventures deeper into the trees, the shadows lengthen and a sudden chill shoots straight down his spine. Our hero stops dead in his tracks, wondering why the atmosphere has suddenly turned so incredibly heavy. His knuckles turn white around the handle, his lungs screaming as if all the oxygen just got sucked right out of the open forest. Bracing for impact, he fully expects some towering nightmare-fuel monstrosity to come bursting out of the brush. Yet instead of a roaring beast, the only sound breaking the silence is the dragging thud of limping footsteps. My guy just blinks in utter confusion as the silhouette draws nearer. Out of the gloom steps the hooded old man, draped in a dark, heavy cloak. He has a scraggly gray beard, his dark eyes locked dead onto Jo-won as he hobbles forward. Feeling an unnatural, bone-deep freeze radiating from the stranger's stare, our boy raises his weapon and demands to know exactly who he's dealing with. Deep in the woods, an unseen tracker scopes out the absolute bloodbath left behind from our boy's desperate brawl. The hooded old man steps into the clearing, reading the massive tracks and confirming that whoever packed up this giant beast was flying solo. Having spent days spying on Jo-won's cabin, the elder notes that the absolute unit of a woodcutter didn't even know which end of an axe to hold. The math just isn't mathing for him. How could a total novice with zero hunting skills possibly solo a raid boss level wolf? Shaking his head in disbelief, the elder knows even a seasoned pro would get absolutely folded trying to survive that encounter unarmed. Suddenly, a sharp sound violently yanks his attention away from the crime scene. Eyes narrowing, he decides he needs to push deeper into the forest to confirm his wild suspicions. Catching up to the source of the noise, his gaze locks onto Jo-won's arm bearing 3 deep jagged claw marks. He recognizes the unmistakable bone-crushing strike of a giant wolf, but the wound is unnaturally clean, completely lacking the fatal infection that should have sent my guy straight to the grave. Staring at our hero, the elder deduces that with shredded muscles and exposed bone, the man shouldn't even be able to stand, let alone walk around like it's a casual Tuesday. Swallowing hard, the hooded old man stares up at the towering man, a crazy theory clicking into place. Could this guy actually be a ridiculously rare mage? In his mind's eye, a vision flashes of legendary spellcasters wielding fire, light, and lightning. Mythical powerhouses that commoners in this brutal world rarely ever get to witness in their lifetimes. If this absolute unit is secretly packing high-tier magic, the hooded old man's brain immediately starts spinning up some incredibly dark possibilities. A sinister purple light flares in the elder's eyes as the realization hits him. The ultimate cheat code for his master plan just walked right into his lap. Staring down our guy in the sunlit clearing, he knows this is it. The once-in-a-lifetime shot at bloody revenge he thought he'd take to the grave. Meanwhile, Jo-won narrows his eyes at the stranger, his danger sense absolutely screaming that something is deeply off about this creepy woodland encounter. The old man remembers it clearly. Decades before he became a washed-up shadow of himself, he was a vigorous young ranger with his whole life ahead of him. Back in those days, surviving the brutal wartime draft as a forest ranger wasn't just a duty, it was the ultimate stepping stone to becoming a powerful noble's right-hand man. Fueled by pure ambition, the the young man ditched his father's shadow and struck out on his own to grind his way up from a lowly village woodcutter. He quickly set up shop in a peaceful valley, eyeing the towering peaks that were absolutely loaded with untapped resources. But the early game was a brutal grind, with every commoner fiercely competing for scraps of firewood at the safe edges of the forest. Refusing to settle for the leftovers, the ambitious ranger made the fateful call to push his luck and venture way deeper into the treacherous peaks. He had no idea the locals avoided the deep woods for a very good reason, completely ignorant to the ironclad rule that a lord's contract required a ranger to have all 4 limbs firmly attached. Venturing deeper into the pitch-black forest, he was completely unaware that his grand dreams of nobility were about to be permanently shattered in one brutal instant. Frozen in the pitch-black woods, the young ranger could only listen in sheer terror as heavy dragging footsteps closed in through the brush. A massive hulking goblin materialized from the shadows, its yellow eyes burning with pure malice. Completely defenseless, he could only watch in absolute horror as the monster backed him against a tree. That night he discovered the horrifying truth of the deep mountains. These creatures survived by kidnapping human women to breed their monstrous offspring. The massive beast grabbed the young ranger by the shoulder from behind, sealing his grim fate. He screamed in pure agony as the monster brutally tore into him, permanently crippling his leg and destroying his future. He barely survived the ordeal, spending the rest of his miserable life festering in a dark room with a ruined limb, utterly consumed by hatred. For decades he lived as a broken shell among the villagers, kept alive by a single burning thought: vengeance. He swore to endure whatever it took, just to live long enough to see the day he could burn that goblin den to ash. Back in the present, the hooded old man stares at Joan, absolutely convinced he has finally found the ultimate weapon for his revenge. Our boy boasts the towering physique of an absolute unit and raw strength that completely breaks the local power scaling. Combine that with an absurd, game-breaking regenerative ability that heals fatal wounds in mere days, and the old-timer is looking at a walking cheat code. The elder knows this absolute unit has the potential to become the greatest monster hunter alive. He knows the goblins are currently biding their time deep in the mountains, but the second they run out of women, they will inevitably raid the village. Stepping forward, the veteran resolves to forge the giant into an exceptional killer before that bloody day comes. Flashing a deceptively warm smile, the old man plots to trick Joan into a magically binding contract before ever dropping the truth about the goblin nest. Completely unaware of the trap, our guy bows respectfully, offering a polite greeting in his foreign tongue. But the old-timer's sharp eyes catch the subtle detail. Even mid-bow, my guy keeps his center of gravity shifted back, fully primed to strike or flee at a moment's notice. Undeterred by the defensive stance, the elder formally offers to take the big man on as his personal apprentice and teach him everything he knows. Our hero just stares back in utter blank confusion at the sudden, unprompted career counseling. Cut to the next morning, where Joan wakes up to the incredibly wholesome sound of Lizzie and Dorothy cooking breakfast by the fireplace. Even with the peaceful domestic vibe, his protective instincts flare up as he immediately checks the window. Outside, he spots the old man approaching the cellar door, and Joan's guard instantly spikes. Glancing back at Lizzie and Dorothy, our boy makes a hard rule right then and there. He is never letting strangers into this house when he isn't around to protect them. Stepping outside to intercept the elder, our hero nearly jumps out of his skin when he realizes the guy is already looming right at the threshold. The hooded old man flashes a warm, closed-eye smile, but Joan's internal scam radar is instantly pinging. In his mind's eye, a grim vision flashes. A slick corporate HR manager back on Earth, weaponizing that exact same friendly grin to lowball a salary negotiation. Still, my guy slings his hunting sack over his broad shoulder, deciding he just has to bite the bullet and learn the ropes if he wants to put food on the table. Turning back toward the cabin, he calls out to Lizzie to let her know he's heading out into the woods. But he pauses in the doorway, catching sight of her clumsily but earnestly struggling to wrap something up by the hot stove. A soft fond smile tugs at his lips as the sheer, undeniable cuteness of her awkward domestic efforts completely melts his heart. Off to the side, little Dorothy silently watches Lizzie's frantic, sweaty packing routine. Suddenly, the blonde girl's face locks into absolute determination as she sprints toward the exit. Sliding to a halt, she throws her tiny arms out wide, physically barricading the giant from leaving the house. Bro is completely caught off guard, at least until Lizzie rushes up behind him clutching a carefully wrapped lunchbox. With a shy blush, she gently tucks the meal into his bag, softly telling him that he needs to eat properly while he's out working. A warm smile spreads across our hero's face, deeply moved by the simple, genuine care of his new family. As he steps out the door, Lizzie calls out a cheerful farewell in her native tongue. Joan points right back, carefully repeating the phrase to make sure he's got the translation down. She nods with a bright, encouraging smile, and he promises to be back before they know it. Lizzie then calls out to Dorothy, who is currently pointing excitedly at Joan's bag. The little girl immediately scurries up to the doorway, loudly echoing the wish for a safe trip. Our boy waves back with pure affection, promising his new daughter he won't be gone long. Walking away, a heavy realization hits our guy. He is completely and utterly reluctant to leave his new home. In his mind's eye, an image of his impossibly cute wife and daughter waving goodbye permanently burns itself into his soul. Still, duty calls, and Joan trails behind the mysterious old man deep into the sunlit woods. Trekking through the brush for what feels like hours, Bro starts to wonder just how far out this hunting lesson is supposed to be. Without warning, the elder stops dead in his tracks, turning around to mutter a string of completely incomprehensible alien syllables. Our guy stares blankly down at the man's boots, completely baffled by the abrupt halt. Without bothering to explain, the hooded old man simply turns his back and resumes his march into the deeper woods. But as Joan watches, the dirt shifts, the elder's footprints supernaturally fading and erasing themselves from the path like a high-level stealth passive. The realization hits our hero like a truck, his eyes widening at the impossible sight. Staring at the vanishing trail, he realizes his creepy new master is hiding secrets far darker than a simple hunting lesson. But instead of calling him out, Joan wonders if this is some kind of high-tier martial arts footwork straight out of a wuxia novel. Deciding that the only way to level up is to mirror the master, our hero falls right into step. He carefully mimics the elder's pacing, matching him stride for stride, trailing right behind the cloaked figure like a shadow. The hooded old man glances back, a sly smirk crossing his face as he notices his new apprentice catching on. Without a single word, the duo continues their march deeper into the woods. Soon enough, the actual hunting tutorial kicks off, starting with the absolute basics of the mountain's flora. The elder literally forces Joan to touch grass, having him map the rugged terrain with his bare hands. After hours of this grueling hands-on trekking, they finally take a breather by a rocky ledge. The old-timer reaches into his leather pouch, pulling out a small dark field ration. He pops it into his mouth and gestures to Joan, who instantly lights up with the hype of a guy who knows it's finally lunchtime. Our boy eagerly unties the cloth bundle, practically vibrating with excitement to finally dig into the meal Lizzie packed for him. He pops the lid off the metal tin, ready to absolutely demolish his food. But just as that heavenly aroma hits his nose, the hooded old man barks at him to stop. Joan freezes like a deer in headlights, completely caught off guard. The elder just shakes his head, pointing a stern finger away from their little picnic spot. He drops some hardcore survival logic, explaining that the scent of cooked food is basically an aggro beacon that will instantly pull every wild beast in the vicinity. Heartbroken, my guy slowly clicks the lid shut, the crushing realization sinking in that this might be the first and last time Lizzie ever packs him a lunch. He looks ready to drop to his knees and cry, while his creepy new master just stands behind him smiling like an absolute menace. After packing away his tragic lunch, Joan follows the elder until they finally reach a rustic cabin hidden deep in the woods. The old man steps out of the doorway, casually holding a bizarrely long, perfectly straight bow. A mental blueprint of standard curved bows flashes before Joan's eyes, leaving him completely baffled since you need that arc to generate tension. Staring at the weapon, our hero seriously questions how anyone could possibly fire an arrow from a rigid piece of wood. The hooded old man tosses the heavy chunk of wood to Joan, barking an order in his alien language before turning on his heel. Still highly skeptical of this whole setup, our boy trails behind him into an open clearing. He figures it would take an absolute monster of a man to generate enough force to bend a rigid log like that. Without a single word, the elder knocks an arrow and draws the string back, the thick wood groaning under his sheer unadulterated power. Despite the insane amount of tension loaded into the weapon, the old man's stance is dead still, completely unfazed by the physical toll. He lets it rip, sending the projectile tearing through the air at a terrifying breakneck speed. It slams into a distant tree trunk with a thunderous, explosive impact that sounds like a literal cannon going off. Joan just stands there in absolute awe, staring at the smoking, splintered crater left behind by a single arrow. Fired up to learn, my guy grabs his own bow and tries to replicate the draw, his massive biceps bulging as he fights against the unyielding wood. The raw tension is way too much, leaving him shaking violently until the elder steps in to physically correct his posture. The old man locks onto his arm with a grip like a hydraulic press, completely stabilizing our hero's trembling frame. With his new master holding him steady, Joan locks his sights on the target, channeling all his focus into the shot. The rest of the day is an absolute blur of intense training, with our boy acting like a sponge to absorb every single piece of survival knowledge. He pushes his physical limits to the absolute brink, knowing he has to become completely self-sufficient out here in the wild. Because more than anything, Joan just wants to be a man capable of protecting and providing for his new wife and daughter. Meanwhile, back at their peaceful little cabin, Dorothy is happily kicking her legs on the bed while Lizzie sings a cheerful, completely made-up song about Joan. The little girl rubs her stuffed belly, absolutely marveling at the unfamiliar sensation of actually being full. She glances over and catches Lizzie laughing, a genuine, carefree sound ringing through the room. It suddenly hits Dorothy that before Joan arrived, neither of them had ever smiled like this. Hearing Lizzie so happy fills the child with a comforting warmth, like she's sitting right next to a crackling stove. But as she lies there digesting her massive meal, an innocent question pops into her head. What exactly is Jo-won to her? In her mind's eye, she pictures him holding her close, trying to piece it together. She knows he's Lizzie's husband, but neither of them are actually her real parents. A dark, terrifying thought creeps into her vision. Will Jo-won eventually walk away and leave her behind, taking only Lizzie with him? In her mind's eye, the little girl pictures herself completely isolated in the dark, watching helplessly as Jo-won takes Lizzie away. Tears well up in Dorothy's eyes as the crushing fear of being left behind completely consumes her. Suddenly she snaps out of the waking nightmare. She bolts upright in a panic, her heart dropping when she realizes Lizzie is nowhere to be found in the room. The dead silence of the cabin triggers a traumatic echo, a phantom voice hissing that she's nothing but a useless burden. In her memory from years ago, her abusive father loomed over her trembling frame, screaming that she was just a waste of food. Driven by that deeply ingrained trauma, she frantically scrambles out of bed to check on their food supply. She peeks over the rim of the wooden tub, letting out a massive sigh of relief when she sees the giant wolf meat is still safe. But that momentary peace is instantly shattered by an aggressive, booming shout echoing from outside. Dorothy violently flinches, absolutely terrified by the threatening tone. Trembling like a leaf, she cautiously pushes open the small wooden window to investigate the commotion. Her blood runs completely cold when she spots 3 armed local thugs standing right in their front yard. In a painful memory from years ago, she watched these exact same scumbags beat her father, a vicious cycle that always ended with him taking his bruised ego out on her and Lizzie. Back in the present, absolute panic sets in as the horrifying realization hits her. What if they beat her stepmother to death? Outside, the blonde thug violently grabs Lizzie by the shoulder, demanding to know where the mouth-watering smell of meat is coming from, and accusing her of being a thief. She desperately stammers out that her new husband hunted it, but the thug just laughs in her face, completely dismissing the idea that anyone could casually bag game in these woods. His brown-haired buddy steps up to run the ultimate guilt trip, aggressively reminding her that they supposedly saved her life by arranging her new marriage after her first husband died. Completely ignoring her tearful denials, the goons decide they're going to raid the cabin to see what else this supposed thief has stashed away. Tired of talking, the blonde leader violently shoves Lizzie straight into the dirt, clearing the path to force his way through the front door. The 3 intruders step into the dimly lit home, their greedy eyes scanning the room like vultures looking for an easy meal. It doesn't take long for them to spot the absolute unit of a giant wolf pelt, resting right in the corner. Dollar signs practically flash in their eyes as the blonde thug runs his hands over the fur, realizing this single monster drop is worth an absolute fortune. Drunk on the prospect of a massive payday, he orders his crew to completely tear the place apart and search every single inch for more premium loot. Meanwhile, huddled under the bed, little Dorothy clutches herself in absolute terror, trembling as the greedy intruders ransack her only safe haven. She clamps both hands over her mouth, praying the shadows keep her hidden from the nightmare tearing through her home. But before the thugs can lay a single finger on the prize, Lizzie bursts into the room, throwing herself squarely between the raiders and the massive fur. Tears stream down her face, but she refuses to yield an inch, fiercely declaring that this belongs to her family now, ready to defend their hard-won happiness at all costs. The blonde thug gets right in Lizzie's face, mocking how she used to be nothing but a silent victim. He viciously backhands her across the face for daring to show some spine now that she has a husband backing her up. The brutal strike sends Lizzie crashing hard against the wooden floorboards. A painful groan escapes her as the metallic taste of blood and the raw sting of humiliation wash over her. Blinking through her daze, she spots little Dorothy huddled in the corner. Swallowing the pain, Lizzie bites her tongue, refusing to cry out and traumatize the kid any further. But a sudden shift from the intruders makes her flinch in terror. Dorothy watches with wide, horrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the same deep-rooted fear that used to keep her hidden away. Tears spill down the little girl's cheeks as the crushing weight of her own helplessness completely breaks her. Looming over Lizzie, the thugs laugh off the threat of her giant husband, figuring his complete lack of the local language makes him a non-issue. Still, they aren't entirely stupid. They know provoking a mountain guardian is a fatal mistake if they actually get caught. So to keep their home invasion off the radar, the blonde leader violently yanks Lizzie up by her arm. The blonde leader tosses the heavy lifting to his crew, violently yanking Lizzie along as his personal prize. Dragging the pleading woman toward the door, he drops a sickening ultimatum. If she breathes a word of this to her husband, they'll come back in the dead of night and burn the cabin to ashes. The thugs just cackle, hauling their stolen jackpot and their terrified hostage out into the daylight. Still huddled behind the furniture, Dorothy watches them leave, the horrifying realization clawing at her that Lizzie is in mortal danger. Terrified of losing her only mother figure, the little girl breaks her golden rule to stay hidden and scrambles out from the shadows. She gasps at the empty, violated doorway. A wail of absolute shattering despair rips from her tiny throat. Climbing onto a crate, she screams out into the void for the only person in this world who can save them. Jo-won. But through the window and her own falling tears, all she can see is the men dragging Lizzie away into the unforgiving tree line. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, our hero is completely oblivious, stretching his sore muscles after a grueling but satisfying day of training. Suddenly, his heavy boots skid to a dead halt in the dirt. The hooded old man stops ahead of him, raising a silent finger to point back toward the village. Our guy gives the old-timer a quick, polite bow of gratitude for the day's lesson. But before he can head back, a distant, agonizing cry echoes through the trees. Dorothy. His head snaps toward the cabin, his heart instantly dropping into his stomach, because he knows his little girl would never cry like that. Panic overriding his exhaustion, our hero breaks into an absolute dead sprint through the dark woods. He bursts into the clearing just in time to catch those 3 local scumbags hauling Lizzie away into the brush. A suffocating, murderous rage instantly ignites within him, his eyes glowing with a terrifying blue light. Startled by the heavy footsteps, the kidnappers turn around. But before they can even process his arrival, Joan's massive fist completely caves in the reddish-brown-haired thug's face. The guy drops like a sack of bricks, out cold before his body even hits the dirt. Lizzie gasps his name, tears of absolute relief flooding her eyes at the sight of her savior. Joan doesn't say a single word, advancing on the remaining 2 like an unstoppable force of nature. Without missing a beat, our boy snatches the dark-haired thug right by the back of the neck, and introduces his face to a devastating, bone-crunching knee strike. The second attacker crumples backward, hitting the dirt and groaning in a fresh pool of his own blood. Desperate and out of options, the blonde leader throws a wild, sloppy haymaker. But Joan effortlessly ducks under the swing, driving his massive shoulder straight into the man's gut. With terrifying ease, he hoists the thug completely off his feet, and slams him spine first into the ground with earth-shattering force. Pinning the gasping leader by the throat, my guy raises a colossal fist. He brings it down like a sledgehammer, determined to teach this trash a lesson they will never forget. Enveloped in a menacing blue aura, Joan resolves to engrave absolute primal terror into their very souls. Lizzie can only watch in stunned silence, completely overwhelmed by the sheer brutality of her gentle giant. She cries out his name, making the hulking man pause mid-strike. Thinking he sees an opening, the blonde thug goes for a desperate sneak attack, swinging a stolen scythe straight for our hero's head. But my guy doesn't even need to look to catch the incoming wrist in an absolute vice grip. With a sickening crunch, Joan violently twists the limb until the bone snaps, pulling a blood-curdling scream from the would-be killer. His right eye burning with an unholy murderous light, the giant grits his teeth, fully prepared to finish the job. Suddenly, the hooded old man bursts into the clearing, shouting for Joan to back down. The veteran ranger physically grabs our boy's arm, desperately trying to restrain the enraged powerhouse before he commits murder. Pointing frantically toward the cabin, the old master demands the giant look at what his unhinged bloodlust is actually doing to his family. Lizzie stands completely frozen in the clearing, her face pale and stricken with absolute shock. And hiding in the distance, little Dorothy is sobbing uncontrollably, utterly terrified by the monster her savior has just become. That sight hits Joan harder than any physical blow ever could, freezing him dead in his tracks. The suffocating, violent aura immediately dissipates, melting away into the cool forest air. Staring at the man who just saved them, the realization claws at Lizzie that this gentle giant harbors a terrifying fury, one that briefly mirrored the brutality of her abusive late husband. For a split second, the shadow of her trauma flares, leaving her terrified that he might turn that same brutal violence on her. But the moment she looks up into our hero's face, every ounce of that fear evaporates. There is absolutely no malice in his gaze, only a raw, desperate need to keep her safe. Instead of anger, our boy looks down at her with heartbreaking guilt, absolutely terrified that he has just ruined whatever trust they had built. He softly calls her name, and Lizzie can't help but wonder why a man with such overwhelming strength cares so deeply about her reaction. She clutches at her bodice, feeling her own heart racing against her ribs. The realization suddenly hits her that her body is trembling involuntarily from the adrenaline crash, making him think she's terrified of him. Seeing the profound wounded look in my guy's eyes completely shatters her heart. She desperately wants to tell him she isn't scared, but the language barrier stands between them like an impenetrable wall. So, calling out his name with sudden determination, she decides to show him instead. She steps right up to the towering man and gently takes his massive bruised hands into her own. And the second she feels the gentle warmth radiating from his battered knuckles, every last lingering doubt completely vanishes. She knows with absolute certainty that as long as she stands by his side, no one will ever be able to hurt her again. Slowly, she lifts his battered hand and presses it tenderly against her blushing cheek. And with tears of pure, overwhelming relief welling in her eyes, she smiles up at our hero and whispers a heartfelt thank you. As Lizzie gently presses her cheek against his battered hand, our boy tenderly pats her back, utterly bewildered as to why she's the one feeling so grateful. In his mind, he's the one who should be on his knees thanking her for giving him the family he's always dreamed of. But their quiet moment is suddenly shattered by a sharp gasp. They turn to find little Dorothy in the doorway, her large golden eyes welling up with fresh tears. Lizzie gasps, immediately pulling away from the embrace. She sprints back toward the cabin, her heart pounding as my guy follows close behind. Bursting through the door, she reaches out to the trembling child, desperately asking if she's hurt. But as she takes in the trashed interior, her expression shifts to pure shock. In front of her, Dorothy stands completely frozen, her tiny body shaking like a leaf as she begins to sob. In her memory of the fight, Jo-won brutally punched the blonde thug in the face, splattering blood in a terrifying display of violence. Back in the present, a traumatic vision flashes behind the girl's eyes, the face of Lizzie, covered in dark, swollen bruises from the men who were supposed to protect them. Terrified that crying will only earn her a beating, the poor kid desperately tries to swallow her sobs. Staring up at Lizzie, her little mind races with the agonizing fear that she's about to be abandoned and treated like a ghost all over again. Unable to hold the panic in any longer, she reaches out her tiny arms, tearfully apologizing for hiding instead of helping. The poor kid takes all the blame onto her own shoulders, begging the only mother figure she has left not to leave her alone. Hearing that absolutely shatters Lizzie's heart, and she drops straight to her knees to pull the sobbing child into a fierce protective embrace. With tears streaming down her own face, she explains that she only pretended not to know Dorothy earlier because she was terrified those monsters would notice her hiding spot. Squeezing the little girl tight, she promises her that she has absolutely nothing to feel guilty about. Pulling back to wipe away the tears, Lizzie gently tells her that everything is fine now, because her papa is here. That brings the waterworks to a screeching halt as Dorothy blinks in innocent confusion, pointing out that Jo-won is Lizzie's husband, not her dad. Letting out a warm chuckle through her tears, Lizzie patiently breaks down how their new family dynamic works. She reminds the kid that since she is officially her stepmother, that automatically makes her new husband Dorothy's papa. Mind completely blown, the little girl turns her gaze toward the massive, imposing man standing out in the forest, tentatively testing the word on her tongue. She whips her head back to Lizzie to ask if this giant really is her new dad, and her stepmom nods, promising that Jo-won is absolutely nothing like the abusive men from their past. Gently patting the kid's head, she assures her that our boy isn't someone who hurts them. He's someone who protects them. In her memory, the image of his brutal knee strike replays, but this time it doesn't look like senseless violence. She finally realizes he was just answering her desperate cry for help. Back in the present, all the terror instantly drains from her little body as she springs to her feet. Rushing straight to the window, she excitedly screams out for her papa at the top of her lungs. Staring out at the towering giant, she is completely awestruck by the realization that this massive, terrifying man is actually her ultimate protector. Without a second thought, she bolts right out the cabin door. As she sprints across the grass, she reaches out for the man who gave her gentle hugs and a beautiful new name. Her face lights up with pure, unadulterated joy at the thought that this wonderful man is officially her father. Out in the yard, our hero's eyes widen in absolute shock as he hears the little girl calling out to him. He drops to one knee just in time to catch Dorothy as she launches herself right into his arms. And even though he still can't understand a single word she's saying, the overwhelming love in her voice is more than enough to bring tears to the big guy's eyes. So he stands up, holding his new daughter securely against his broad chest. But as he holds her close, a sudden, unmistakable scent hits his nose. Feeling the dampness soaking through her pink dress, he realizes the poor girl was so utterly terrified by the thugs that she actually peed herself. Yet looking down at her radiant, innocent smile, our boy can't even bring himself to care, simply resolving to get her cleaned up before she catches a cold. Right on cue, Lizzie rushes over, her face glowing with absolute relief as she joins them in the trees. She throws her arms around both of them, pulling her new family into a tight, heartwarming embrace that finally washes away the nightmare of the morning. The beautiful, tear-jerking moment is suddenly derailed when Dorothy's eyes go wide with sheer panic. Screaming about the stolen meat, she abruptly wriggles out of Jo-won's grip and bolts back toward the yard. Completely ignoring the groaning, broken thugs scattered across the grass, her tiny legs carry her as fast as they can go. Skidding to a halt in front of the heavy wooden bucket, her golden eyes lock onto the precious food. Gritting her teeth, the little girl grabs the handle and pulls with all her might. Unfortunately, the payload is way too heavy for a kid her size, and she immediately loses her balance, toppling backward. Seeing her tip, Jo-won and Lizzie instantly sprint forward in a total panic. But fueled by a sheer, unyielding obsession with meat, Dorothy miraculously catches herself mid-fall, her eyes going completely blank with pure determination. Our hero can only watch in absolute disbelief as the tiny child somehow starts dragging the massive bucket across the dirt. He sweat drops at her terrifying dedication, while Lizzie just bursts into warm, relieved laughter beside him. Stepping up right behind the struggling kid, Jo-won effortlessly lifts the heavy payload with a single hand. Freed from the weight, Dorothy throws her arms wide, staring up at the giant in absolute starstruck awe. My guy chuckles to himself, realizing that becoming this kid's ultimate hero is as simple as providing a solid meal. The wholesome moment breaks when Lizzie claps her hands, snapping them out of their daze and ordering the food brought inside. Pointing toward the open door, she urges Jo-won to get Dorothy out of the dangerous forest. Eagerly chanting about her dinner, the little girl waddles into the cabin, with her new dad following close behind. Setting the bucket down safely indoors, Joan leans against the doorframe and lets out a massive heavy sigh of relief. But the second his gaze shifts back outside, his expression instantly darkens, his eyes locking right back onto the three thugs still groaning in the dirt. The suffocating aura explodes right back out of him, his eyes flaring with a terrifying purple light as he seriously contemplates finishing the job. But before he can take a single step, the hooded old man suddenly materializes out of nowhere, throwing an arm out to physically block his path. The veteran ranger shakes his head, sternly warning our hero that catching a murder charge today is strictly off limits. Joan squeezes his eyes shut, his massive fist trembling as he forces the bloodlust down, acutely aware that getting arrested would just drag him right back to the slave market. He glances back toward the cabin where Lizzie is watching, reminding himself that he isn't a solo act anymore. He has a family to protect. So instead of ending them, the giant stands tall over the broken trash mobs, delivering a chilling ultimatum. If they ever show their faces on his turf again, he'll show them a fate far worse than death. Satisfied, the old master taps his apprentice's chest, nodding in approval before gesturing for him to head back inside. Yet before leaving the drop zone, my guy spots the thug's wooden toolbox and scoops it up, knowing they'll need every practical advantage they can get to survive the harsh mountain winter. The moment he steps back through the doorway, all that lingering darkness instantly vanishes at the sight of Lizzie happily spinning Dorothy in the air. A genuine warm smile spreads across his face as he hauls his new loot inside, finally feeling like he's exactly where he belongs. He drops to one knee on the floorboards, quietly unpacking the confiscated gear while the sound of his new family's laughter fills the room. And as he sets a heavy hammer down, he makes a silent, unbreakable vow to never let the tragedy of his past life repeat itself. He looks up at Lizzie and Dorothy, swearing to protect his new family at all costs. Moments later, Joan gently brushes Lizzie's bruised cheek, silently wishing if he could use the magic to heal her on the spot. Instead, she playfully pinches his face, stretching his cheeks into a forced smile to prove she's perfectly fine. The awkward look on his face is enough to make her burst into laughter, instantly melting the heavy mood. Then, without a word of warning, he sweeps her right off her feet into a smooth bridal carry. She casually mentions how cold the floor is, but the moment the words leave her mouth, Joan completely freezes. Absolute shock washes over his features. And no wonder. Lizzie touches her face in astonishment, realizing the dark mark has completely vanished. He stares back in pure disbelief, the realization hitting him that his desperate magic training from earlier actually worked. He excitedly declares he can finally use healing magic, leaving his wife utterly confused by the sudden outburst. Meanwhile, down in the village, a furious shout shatters the morning peace. The older woman violently kicks a squawking chicken out of her path, loudly complaining about someone sticking their nose where it doesn't belong. Unfazed, the village chief crosses his arms and asks if handing over a little fabric to the mountain guardian really bothers her that much. She angrily retorts that she saved that material for 10 long years, but the elder insists his hands were tied. He explains that the dark-haired giant looks like a seasoned fighter, and the village desperately needs him to protect this year's harvest. Clicking his tongue, he calls her a foolish woman who just can't see the bigger picture. He remembers it clearly. Just yesterday, when he handed our boy some fabric, he noticed the fresh beast bites on the giant's arm were already closing up at an impossible speed. Back in the present, the chief pieces it all together. Gus was right on the money, and our guy is actually a priceless healing mage. He strokes his chin, realizing he has to tread carefully. After all, the nobility would kill to get their hands on an asset like that. The image of a grand, opulent palace burns behind his eyes, as he calculates the sheer fortune the crown itself might pay for such a living miracle. A sinister, greedy smile twists his wrinkled face as he envisions elevating his status far beyond a mere village chief. He quietly gloats that the uneducated villagers are completely oblivious to the absolute goldmine living right in their woods. But a sudden premonition hits him. If rumors spread, heavily armored knights or a powerful guild might snatch Joan away before he can cash in. Visualizing the perfect setup, he decides to have Gus keep a close eye on the big guy while he sneaks off to secretly broker a deal with a wealthy noble. Snapping out of his daydream, he instructs the older woman to start getting close to Joan's new wife. He warns her that the dark-haired giant is sharp, and if they aren't careful, he might realize they've been skimming the local lord's goods and report them. He places a manipulative hand on her shoulder, suggesting she exploit the big guy's deep affection for Lizzie to score some cheap rabbit pelts. The woman nods along to the scheme and turns to leave. Now alone, the chief decides they need to return some of the stolen items to the cabin to keep their golden goose from getting suspicious. He gathers some sticks from the dirt, acknowledging that this outsider is on a completely different level from the random slaves they usually drag in. As a nearby fire roars to life, he ominously notes that it's a shame, but sacrifices must be made. The flames illuminate his sinister smile as he solidifies his ruthless mindset. Sometimes you have to give up a little flesh to get the bones. A few days later, that calculated peace seems to be holding, with cheerful humming drifting from Joan's wooden cabin. Inside, Joan pulls on his tunic, genuinely warmed to hear Lizzie in such high spirits. He watches her happily unpack a paper bag and some metal milk jugs, noting that the chief actually sent over a fresh batch of supplies that morning. Honestly, he's a bit puzzled, but totally amused by how overjoyed she is over getting her basic belongings back. She wasn't even this hyped when he literally healed her face with magic. Smiling softly to himself, our hero reflects that true happiness really is just found in the little things. He closes the distance between them, his heart swelling with a deep, undeniable affection for his wife. But when he announces he's heading out for the day, she shoots up from her seat in surprise. That sudden panic quickly melts into a wholesome, playful exchange as she giggles and tells him to take care. He waves goodbye from the open doorway, letting a profound sense of peace wash over him. Once out in the yard, he remembers the hooded old man's plan to go rabbit hunting today. He strolls past the firewood pile, genuinely hoping they actually manage to catch something. A mental image of Dorothy happily dancing around with meat bones pops into his head, fueling his drive to bring home a good meal for the little girl. Yet as his grip tightens on his small axe, a cold sweat breaks out. Can he actually bring himself to brutally murder a tiny, innocent animal? He shakes his head vigorously, trying to force himself to abandon those soft modern sensibilities if he wants to survive as a hunter in this brutal world. The problem is, every time he pictures a cute, fluffy white rabbit, his mind immediately conjures an image of his adorable wife with bunny ears, leaving him blushing furiously at the thought of harming it. He looks up into the bright green canopy, sending a quick prayer to the universe that if they do find a target, it's at least completely hideous. Suddenly, a terrifying shadowy creature with glowing red eyes and a single sharp horn emerges from the bushes, granting that wish in the absolute worst way possible. Our boy wipes the sweat from his brow after wrapping up his morning chores. With the water drawn and the firewood stacked, he realizes he's actually got some rare free time on his hands. So he stretches out under the warm sun and decides it's the perfect time to grind some magic practice. He looks down at his palms, noting that while popping a quick heal has become second nature, he still can't produce a single spark of offensive flame. In his mind's eye he pictures that desperate knight, choking out the pale-fanged monster as his hand blazed with a fierce burning aura, which makes him wonder if the magic only answered his call because his HP was literally flashing red. Shaking off the thought, my guy takes a deep breath and tries to consciously channel his inner mana. He thrusts his hand forward and confidently calls out a classic fire spell. Yet nothing happens at all, leaving him standing there in a painfully awkward silence. He pictures how hyped Dorothy would be to see a flashy pyrotechnic display, since the kid is totally unimpressed by the subtle glow of his healing buffs. He lowers his arm with a heavy sigh, lamenting that he can't put on a cool magic show for his new daughter. Suddenly, a tiny, defiant spark crackles to life at his fingertips. It quickly settles into a lighter-sized flame, bringing a surprised, goofy grin to our boy's face. Just then, the cabin door creaks open, and a sleepy Dorothy wanders outside, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes. But those golden eyes snap wide open the second she spots the glowing light. She points at him with pure, unadulterated hype, thrilled to see her new dad wielding actual fire magic. He quickly pulls his hand back to keep her from getting burned, but the kid is already buzzing with excitement, eager to share the massive news. She just stares at the flickering heat in starstruck awe. Hearing the sudden commotion, Lizzie rushes out into the yard, frantically calling her daughter's name. Then she stops dead in her tracks, her hands flying to her mouth in pure shock at the sight of the glowing magic. As his family marvels at the tiny pyrotechnics, my guy internally hopes he can eventually level up his output enough to at least light a decent campfire. But right in the middle of the wholesome moment, Lizzie's eyes widen as she suddenly remembers something urgent. Without a single word of explanation, she spins around and sprints back toward the house, leaving our hero standing there completely bewildered. Dorothy immediately chases after her mother, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind them and cutting the magic show short. Left standing alone in the yard, our boy stares at the tiny flame still flickering on his finger, feeling entirely deflated. He waves his hand around in the cold air, suddenly realizing he has no idea how to turn the spell off. Staring at the stubborn little fire, he just sighs and resigns himself to waiting for it to burn out. Without warning, the flame vanishes with a soft pop, taking him by surprise. Trudging back toward the cabin, my guy shakes his head, reflecting on how utterly bizarre and unpredictable magic is in this world. Stepping inside, a soft rustling sound catches his attention, and he spots Dorothy across the room. The little girl is hyper-fixated, staring intently into the large wooden bucket they use to store their food. She turns back to him with a heartbreakingly disappointed pout, lamenting just how small their meat supply has gotten. Lizzie can't help but chuckle at her daughter's dramatic sulking, while our hero fully understands the kid's sorrow. With fierce determination, he promises to bring back fresh rabbit meat for her today. But his heroic vow is suddenly interrupted by a raspy voice calling his name from the doorway. He turns to find the hooded old man waiting outside to begin their hunt. Right on cue, our guy grabs his gear and announces it's time to hit the road. Fully equipped with his bow and quiver, he steps to the door just as Dorothy comes sprinting up to bid him a safe trip. He gives her blonde head an affectionate pat, praising her for being the ultimate good girl. Then Lizzie steps up, her eyes filled with genuine concern as she tells her husband to stay safe out there. To seal the deal, Jo-won leans in and plants a tender goodbye kiss right on her lips, catching Dorothy off guard. Not wanting to be left out of the romance, the little girl puckers up and adorably demands a smooch of her own. Lizzie cracks up as the big guy happily drops to one knee to oblige. He plants a loving peck right on her cheek, basically cementing his total devotion to this newfound family. And the whole wholesome scene is capped off perfectly when Lizzie playfully busts the kid for sneaking yet another piece of meat. But playtime is officially over, and leaving the warmth of his home behind, Jo-won follows Gus deep into the scenic mountain forest. The old man doesn't waste a single second, immediately turning the trek into a survival pop quiz by pointing out which trees make top-tier firewood. He even forces his new apprentice to stop and inspect literal rabbit droppings on the dirt path, teaching him the gritty reality of tracking. But the lesson is abruptly cut short when Gus throws up a hand and orders him to halt. The old ranger aims his wooden staff toward a rustling thicket just off the trail, and when our guy peers through the brush, his eyes practically bulge out of his skull. Caught in a thick rope snare is a jacked, monstrously muscular beast that Gus casually brushes off as a normal rabbit. Jo-won just stares in utter disbelief, wondering if this terrifying cryptid is some bizarre evolutionary offshoot of a kangaroo. Proving it's no harmless bunny, the trapped beast violently snarls, thrashing its massive frame against the bindings. Gus calmly observes the creature's frantic energy, noting that it hasn't been snared for long, making it the perfect target for his apprentice's first real hunt. Flashing a knowing smirk, the veteran ranger warns that taking down a beast that actively wants to rip your throat out is no walk in the park. He explains that crossing that line and taking a life is a heavy, profound experience, one that still lingers deep in his own old bones. With the stage set, he instructs the big guy to knock the arrow he gave him earlier. As our hero readies his bow, Gus praises his sharp mind, genuinely impressed by how rapidly he's adapted to the mountain's harsh environment. Then, locking eyes with a dead serious glare, the old man officially passes the torch, telling Jo-won that this kill belongs to him. He promises to show our guy exactly how cruel the hunt really is, vowing to burn this lesson into his memory forever. Following orders, Jo-won steps closer to the thrashing beast, but then Gus drops a shocking command. He tells him to shoot the rabbit's foot first, using the creature's agony as practice for hitting a live moving target. He coldly lays out the progression of a hunter's training, escalating from a stationary mark to a desperate animal thrashing in pain. Yet he warns that the mountain is impartial and unforgiving. If a hunter acts with unnecessary cruelty, the day will inevitably come when the beasts take the upper hand. The old ranger emphasizes that remembering this brutal reality is the only way Jo-won will ever make it back home alive. Our hero draws his bowstring back, but his mind screams against the instruction, sickened by the thought of inflicting useless torture on a trapped animal. Sighting down the arrow, he struggles to wrap his head around his new master's seemingly sadistic methods. Gus just impatiently barks at him to take the shot. Foot first, then the head. Before he can release the string, the trapped beast suddenly whips its head around, locking its glowing yellow eyes dead onto him, and letting out an eerie human-like giggle. That deeply unsettling sound sends a spike of ice straight down Jo-won's spine, instantly dragging a dark buried memory to the surface. He remembers it clearly. He woke up in a cramped, rotting slave cell, just another starving, emaciated prisoner chained in the dark. Surrounded by the decaying corpses of the fallen, he had been completely helpless, trapped in a nightmare where humans were treated like livestock. Back in the present, the muscular rabbit suddenly snaps its snare with a sickening crack, lunging straight for him with its razor-sharp teeth bared. In that split second, our guy finally gets it. Gus isn't trying to teach him senseless cruelty, but the ruthless do-or-die reality of survival. So without another ounce of hesitation, he lets the bowstring fly. The shot is dead on, burying the arrow deep into the charging beast with a violent spray of blood. The arrow finds its mark, burying itself deep into the monstrous rabbit's side. Our guy is genuinely stunned that his shot connected. But Gus isn't letting him celebrate, barking at him to draw another shaft and strike the beast again. This time, the old ranger specifically orders him to aim for the front paws. A cruel instruction that leaves our hero confused but compliant. He knows he can't afford to feel pity for the creature, not when Lizzie and Dorothy are depending on him to put food on the table. Right on cue, the injured beast lets out a horrific blood-curdling shriek. Yet Jo-won holds his aim steady, forcing himself to tune out the agonizing cries. Driven by his unwavering duty to provide for his new family, he lets the second arrow fly. It strikes true, and in that brutal moment, Jo-won accepts that he's willing to become a ruthless killer if it means keeping his loved ones safe. Afterward, a heavy silence falls over the forest as he reflects on the sheer cruelty of intentionally prolonging the animal's suffering. While Gus casually packs the bloody carcass into a sack, Jo-won comes to terms with the ugly, unromantic reality of survival in this harsh world. Staring down at his own hands, he makes a solemn vow to never forget the moral weight of the life he just took. His brooding is cut short as Gus hands over a sack of their earlier catches, telling our guy to take the haul and head home. The old ranger follows it up with a warm nod, offering a sincere thanks for his help today. Then, leaning heavily on his walking stick, he hauls himself to his feet and announces they've got one last catch to collect before calling it a day. Hearing that, our hero just offers a silent nod, his gaze dropping heavily to the lifeless rabbit resting in his sack as the quiet reality of the kill finally sinks in. That heavy silence is quickly broken when Gus spots movement in the brush, instructing his apprentice to hurry up and snag their last target. Though the old man notes this one looks a bit different from the rest. But as they move on to their final catch, our guy suddenly stops in his tracks, struck by a sudden realization. Instead of just slaughtering their next target, he pitches the old man a long-term survival strat: capture it alive and breed it, securing his family a steady, sustainable food supply for emergencies. Though, since his vocabulary is still basically non-existent, pitching that master plan requires a whole lot of frantic hand-waving and broken caveman speak. Watching this absolute unit of a man flail around like a toddler, Gus actually has to stifle a laugh. Amused, the old ranger finally caves, giving our boy the green light to bag the bizarre creature alive. Gus hands over a heavy sack with strict orders to bring the prize back breathing, and Joan snatches it up without hesitation. With the old ranger watching from the sidelines, he locks onto his target. Sacking his pride for a minute, our hero creeps forward through the brush with an open burlap bag. His target is a strange little white furball sitting completely oblivious in the weeds. With the live catch secured, the scene shifts back to the peaceful wooden cabin. Inside, standing by the window with Gus, Joan reflects on the hollow existence he left behind. A life where he never even dared to hope for a family of his own. But now, quietly whittling a piece of wood in the warmth of this new reality, everything has changed. For the first time ever, the big guy truly has a reason to live, and a reason to put in the work. Just as that thought settles in, something in the corner of the room catches his eye. It's a small wooden box filled with carved signs, each stamped with the unfamiliar symbols of this world's alphabet. Snatching one up, a huge light bulb goes off in his head. He practically sprints over to the old ranger, eagerly jabbing a finger at the carvings and using every scrap of his broken vocabulary to beg for a reading lesson. Gus raises a skeptical eyebrow, asking if he's really serious about this, and Joan doesn't hesitate to confirm. Scratching his head, the old man figures he might as well humor his hulking new apprentice. Digging into a nearby wooden chest, Gus pulls out a few extra supplies to help him along. He hands over a bundle of carved wooden signs, and our boy is absolutely buzzing with excitement as he begs to start right away. Giving a resigned sigh, the old ranger tells him to follow, and Joan falls in step without missing a beat. Soon enough, the absolute unit of a man is hunched over a tiny desk, awkwardly gripping a quill as he painstakingly practices his letters on parchment. Watching him work, Gus can't help but wonder what a brute like him even needs to read for. The sight of those wooden signs brings back memories of his own youth. He'd originally bought those very materials hoping to earn military merit and land a cushy job with a noble. But looking down at his ruined leg, a bitter wave of regret hits him. If he'd known his life would end up like this, he never would have wasted so much time hitting the books. He quickly shakes the thought away, turning his back on the past while his giant apprentice keeps scribbling. Shifting his gaze out the open door toward the jagged peaks, the old man focuses on his real goal, scouting deeper into the mountains to track down the goblin village. Spring is arriving, which means the foul little monsters are entering their mating season, and their activity is about to spike. Glancing back at Joan, Gus has to admit that despite his lack of experience, my guy learns incredibly fast and could easily hold his own alongside seasoned adventurers. And he's going to need that raw power soon, because a sharp, familiar throb in Gus's injured leg is all the proof he needs that they'll be crossing paths with those damn goblins any day now. And when that day comes, the old ranger makes a dark, bone-chilling vow to slaughter every last one of the green bastards. Meanwhile, in another cabin, the vibe is a whole lot more wholesome. Lizzie is busy playing tailor, cutting out some fresh fabric for her little girl. And Dorothy is bouncing off the walls, asking for the 100th time when her new fit is going to drop, earning a soft laugh from her mom. Their cozy moment is interrupted by a sudden crunch of footsteps outside. Just then, our hero steps through the door, and the kid immediately sprints over to tackle her papa with a massive hug. He scoops her right up, totally melting as she excitedly brags about the brand new clothes Lizzie is making for her. But as he settles in, he drops a heavy tied-up burlap sack onto the floorboards. A sack that suddenly starts violently twitching on its own. Dorothy stares at the squirming bundle in pure awe, asking if her dad just brought home some kind of crazy bag magic, which he quickly shoots down. Instead, he promises to show her what's inside, effortlessly working the thick knot loose with one hand while still holding her. A casual flex of dad's strength that definitely leaves Lizzie impressed. Stepping in to help, Lizzie reaches to loosen the final loops of the rope, completely unaware of the chaotic unboxing they're about to trigger. The second the fabric falls away, a pair of long white ears pops into view. Dorothy gasps, jabbing a tiny finger at the bundle as it shifts again. Dropping from our hero's arms, she rushes forward with a delighted squeal, thrilled to finally see a real bunny. But Lizzie immediately goes into protective mom mode, reaching out to stop her from getting too close to a wild animal. Cautiously, she pulls the rest of the rough burlap down to free the little guy. Without warning, the creature bursts out of the sack like a fuzzy cannonball, startling Lizzie so badly she falls flat on her back. Dorothy freezes in her tracks, her eyes going wide as saucers as she processes what she's looking at. Gesturing frantically at their new pet, she yells out that there's something seriously wrong with this rabbit, because right between those twitching ears sits a sharp, unmistakable horn, proving my guy didn't just bring home a cute pet. He caught a literal monster. Dorothy thinks the bizarre horned rabbit is the cutest thing she's ever seen, but Lizzie immediately warns her to keep her distance. The protective mother points out that a sharp horn on a wild beast usually means danger. Still, not wanting to disappoint her daughter, she nervously volunteers to catch the little monster herself. Taking a deep breath, she lunges forward for the grab, and to her utter shock, she snatches it right up without a single fight. She stares at her hands, utterly baffled as to why a wild creature didn't even try to bolt. But as the tiny beast twitches weakly in her grip, she spots a dark smudge on its lower body and realizes the poor thing is badly injured. Seeing the wound, Dorothy immediately panics, completely heartbroken that the bunny is in pain. With teary eyes, the little girl turns to our guy, begging her new papa to fix it. Right on cue, Joan steps up and offers to take the creature off Lizzie's hands. He gently scoops the trembling monster into his massive palms to get a closer look. To everyone's sheer amazement, a warm, magical light begins to emanate from his hands. In seconds, the nasty wound entirely vanishes without a trace. Dorothy looks up at our hero like he's a literal superhero. He clears his throat, secretly loving every second of the adoration as the little girl hugs his leg. But before he can even set the healed creature down, she yells for him to wait. She goes sprinting off and rushes right back with a woven basket. My guy carefully lowers their new pet inside. Safe at last, the exhausted little monster immediately curls up and falls fast asleep. Joan gently tells Dorothy to protect the bunny, though the ongoing language barrier leaves her thoroughly confused. That's when Lizzie steps in to softly translate, explaining that Papa wants her to be its official caretaker. The kid's face completely lights up as she proudly accepts the mission. Sitting peacefully on the floor with her new family, she gently pats the sleeping creature and promises to keep it safe. Later that night, a peaceful quiet settles over the little wooden cabin. Inside, Dorothy is already fast asleep, her new pet resting safely right by her bed. Meanwhile, our guy stays up practicing his reading with Lizzie, reflecting on the funny nature of human greed. He admits to himself that even though he was just desperate to survive a few days ago, now that he has a home, he already wants to expand it to give his daughter more room to run. And with a real family to protect, he's more determined than ever to master their language. But as he looks over at Lizzie, he knows exactly what he's most grateful for. He knows she has to be totally exhausted from working all day, yet here she is, patiently sounding out words for him. Wanting to show his thanks, he reaches out and gently begins massaging her tense shoulders. A soft blush spreads across her cheeks as she slowly leans back into his warm touch. His hands slide smoothly down her arms, until he catches her hands in her lap, gently intertwining his fingers with hers. Pulling her close, he wraps her in a tender, protective embrace from behind. The romantic tension in the quiet room is undeniable, as they just hold each other. And with a soft breath, the lantern is blown out, leaving the two of them in the peaceful dark. Meanwhile, far from that cozy cabin, a carriage rattles down a sunlit forest path the very next day. Inside, the passengers are packed together like sardines for the grueling journey to the city. Among them is the village chief, chuckling darkly to himself as he endures the cramped ride. He remembers it clearly. Our guy stood over that defeated blonde thug like an absolute mountain of muscle. Back in the present, the old man knows that healing mages are usually small and frail, making a powerhouse who can regenerate wounds information worth its weight in solid gold. But his greedy scheming is suddenly interrupted when the other travelers start gossiping about summoned heroes. Squished between them, he listens as they discuss wild rumors that the neighboring enemy nation might have just summoned a legendary savior of their own. One of the men scoffs at the idea, wondering how anyone would even recognize a mythical figure from hundreds of years ago anyway. Hearing this lore drop, the elder starts sweating bullets, suddenly remembering just how dangerously close their little village is to the enemy border. Panicked by the very real threat of an invasion, he resolves to sell the giant's secret as fast as possible, grab his cash and flee before war breaks out. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Dorothy is busy poking her new sleeping horned rabbit. Lizzie gently scolds her, reminding the kid that this particular bunny isn't for eating. The little girl puffs her cheeks, highly offended that her mom would even suggest she'd snack on a baby. But when Lizzie reaches over to wipe a very telling drop of drool from her chin, Dorothy quickly changes the subject. Deflecting hard, she excitedly announces that she's going to feed the normal rabbits outside and bolts for the door. Trotting into the yard, she pauses when she notices a brand new wooden fence our boy has been building. Shaking off the distraction, she snaps back to her actual mission. She marches right up to the outdoor hutch, totally ready to knock out her chores. Taking one look at the normal livestock, she bluntly calls them big and ugly compared to her magical new pet. Still, she holds out a handful of leafy greens and generously tells them to eat up. Playing the role of a very busy adult, She warns the bunnies to behave because she has a lot on her plate today. Yet as she sets the leaves down, she blinks in surprise at a fresh pile of food that's already sitting right there. Her golden eyes go wide as she jumps to the only logical conclusion. She must have just used magic. A vision takes hold of her. In her mind's eye, she instantly pictures herself conjuring a literal mountain of meat, earning a standing ovation from her awestruck parents. Back in the present, totally oblivious to the fact that someone else already fed the bunnies hours ago, the little girl cheers for her own imaginary prowess. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the mood is much heavier as Lizzie sits on the floor, anxiously hugging the giant wolf pelt. A merchant carriage is scheduled to pass through the village soon, and she knows the massive hide would fetch a premium price. She pictures our hero finally outfitted in proper clothes and sturdy boots, along with a desperate haul of the basic cooking supplies they so severely lack. Back in the present, looking down at the single measly rabbit pelt lying beside her, she knows it won't be nearly enough to trade for what they need. She grips the dark fur tightly, entirely unable to part with Joanne's very first hunt. Making a resolute decision, she reaches back and ties her beautiful long hair into a tight ponytail. Then, with a trembling hand, she picks up a pair of sharp scissors. Later that afternoon, our hero finally calls out from the doorway, returning home from his training. Dorothy immediately tackles him with a joyful hug, which the giant warmly returns as he drops to one knee. But when he stands back up to greet Lizzie, his eyes go wide in pure shock. Because to afford the supplies they desperately need without selling his prized wolf pelt, she has chopped off every last lock of her beautiful hair. Our hero stares in pure shock at Lizzie's suddenly missing hair. Right beside him, Dorothy frantically circles her mother, demanding to know where it went. The little girl crosses her arms with a pout, mourning the loss of those pretty long locks. But Joanne immediately pieces together the heartbreaking reason behind the new cut. He steps toward his wife, his voice heavy with emotion as he calls her name. Gently stroking her shortened hair, the giant offers a sincere apology for the sacrifice she had to make. Lizzie is entirely taken aback by his unexpected empathy. After all, in this unforgiving world, a woman's hair is usually nothing more than a desperate commodity, grown out solely to be bartered away for survival. Yet right now, Joanne's tender comfort entirely overwrites that grim reality, bringing warm tears to her eyes. Throwing her arms around him, she realizes she isn't sad at all. She's incredibly happy. Watching them, Dorothy beams at her parents' heartwarming embrace. A little later, the family prepares to head out, with the giant strapping Dorothy into a wooden carrier on his back, and offering to carry Lizzie too. She politely declines the free ride, so he just hoists his thrilled daughter up instead. With everyone ready, the trio sets off together down the sunlit forest path. It isn't long before the trees give way to a bustling, heavily populated mountain town. The moment they hit the streets, Dorothy eagerly sprints ahead, utterly hypnotized by the delicious smells wafting from the market. Trailing behind her, Joanne takes in the crowded thoroughfare, suddenly hit by a heavy wave of nostalgia. He watches the locals go about their busy day, the sheer volume of people feeling strangely familiar. Pausing in his tracks, his eyes lock onto a random passing stranger. In a memory of his past life on Earth, he walked alone through the freezing snow, quietly watching a happy family pass him by. He felt the crushing, suffocating loneliness of navigating those crowded holiday streets without a single soul to call his own. Back in the present, he snaps out of the memory and looks over at his beautiful wife walking right by his side. Then his gaze shifts to his bouncing, excited daughter, and he finally understands the true, overwhelming joy of having a family. But there's no time to get too emotional, because the little blonde dynamo is already sprinting straight toward a nearby merchant stall. She waves her parents over, practically vibrating with excitement to check out the goods. Right on cue, the vendor behind the stall starts barking out his top dollar prices to hook the crowd. The little girl just stares up at the bustling display in pure awe. That is, until a young blonde boy suddenly pops up right beside her. Never one to hold back, she bluntly points a finger and announces that he looks scary, thoroughly confusing the poor kid. Watching from a few steps back, Joanne realizes with a sweat drop that the kid actually bears a striking resemblance to his own intimidating mug. While the kids bicker, Lizzie steps up to the counter and slides over her bundled cut hair along with the rabbit pelt. The deceitful vendor takes one look and immediately starts downplaying their value, sighing that the market is absolutely flooded with pelts lately. But internally, the guy is practically drooling over the flawless glossy quality of the fur, already plotting to scam her out of a fortune. Fully buying the lie, Lizzie's shoulders slump in defeat as she quietly accepts his pathetic lowball of an offer. The scammer mentally high-fives himself over the easy mark, right up until a massive suffocating shadow swallows him whole. Because Joanne is now looming right behind his wife, radiating a terrifying pitch-black aura that promises total destruction if this guy doesn't fix his attitude real quick. He just stares the scammer down in heavy, suffocating silence. Then, without a single word, he snatches Lizzie's hair and the wolf pelt right off the counter. Before the old man can even protest, Joanne wraps a protective arm around his wife and locks his free hand onto the vendor's wrist, crushing bone with a punishing grip. Ignoring the scammer's pained gasps, he calmly tells Lizzie they're taking their business to another town because this guy's eyes are practically screaming deceit. She immediately worries about the long walk ahead, entirely missing how the vendor is internally panicking over the giant's monstrous, unyielding strength. But the giant gently reassures her, explaining that her goods are in pristine condition and she was being blatantly cheated. As the scammer stammers out a pathetic defensive denial, the realization finally clicks for Lizzie that her naivety almost cost them a fortune. Sweating bullets under Joanne's lethal glare, the vendor desperately backpedals, throwing in salt, a pot, and extra clothes just to save the deal. Lizzie just stares back at him, utterly baffled by the sudden drastic change in his tune. Joanne isn't having any of it, firmly grabbing her wrist to lead her away to someone who will actually pay them what they're worth. He even sweetly offers to carry her the entire distance, though she happily insists her own 2 legs work just fine. Left behind the counter, the deceitful vendor can only watch in utter dismay as the highest-grade catch of the day walks right out of his life. Desperate, he calls out for them to wait, begging for just one more minute. But it's way too late, and the scammer just slumps over his counter in total crushing defeat. Meanwhile, Joanne and Lizzie stroll away in high spirits, leaving him to wallow in his well-deserved ruin. A little later, Dorothy is busy proudly boasting to the village children about her amazing dad. When Lizzie finally calls her over, the little girl happily skips ahead of her parents as they start the long trek home. Sometime later, she's fast asleep in the pitch black, fully comforted by her father's safe familiar scent. Half awake, she groggily wonders why she suddenly feels so incredibly warm after freezing just a moment ago. And no wonder. Her dad has literally tucked the sleeping girl safely inside his massive coat to shield her from the cold. But the cozy nap ends when she suddenly jolts awake, her little head popping out of the collar as she remembers her pet rabbit. She eagerly demands to be put down right this second so she can go feed it. Chuckling, the giant gently sets her down on her own 2 feet. The second her shoes hit the dirt, she sprints toward the rabbit pen, absolutely thrilled to be back home. Snatching up a handful of fresh grass, she excitedly calls out to Rabbit Buddy. But the moment she peers over the fence, her eyes go wide in pure shock. The pen is entirely empty. Devastated, the poor kid drops her handful of greens and immediately bursts into tears. Hearing the wails, Lizzie rushes over in a panic to see what's wrong. Through her heavy sobs, Dorothy begs for her missing pet to come back. The sudden commotion brings Joanne stepping back out of the cabin to investigate. He asks what happened, and Lizzie tearfully explains that the bunny has pulled a vanishing act. That's when he realizes his wife is actually crying too. Not because she misses the creature, but because she knows how hard he worked to catch it. He just stares at her, utterly taken aback by this overwhelming display of empathy. And then the giant throws his head back and bursts into hearty booming laughter. An offended Dorothy weakly punches his leg for mocking her tragedy, but Joanne isn't bothered at all. He just finds his little family incredibly adorable, knowing full well he can always just go catch another one. Watching his 2 favorite people fuss over something so small, the giant realizes he's finally found the true, simple happiness he always prayed for. Meanwhile, far from the warmth of the cabin, Gus creeps up behind a massive boulder in the deep forest. The old ranger has finally tracked down the mountain goblin village, and his bloody campaign of revenge is about to begin. Deep in the dark forest, Gus watches a lone goblin from the shadows, white-knuckling his staff to hold back the urge to attack. He knows charging in would be a dog's death, especially since the monster's hidden camp is already bursting at the seams. The old ranger calculates the grim reality. If even one of these green-skinned freaks loses control and raids the village, the entire pack will follow suit in a bloodthirsty frenzy. On their own, they're pathetic, but their true terror lies in their pack tactics, breeding like literal rabbits to replace any lost troops. And the grim reality of how they multiply is a fate worse than death, relying on kidnapped women who are forced to bear their monstrous spawn until they finally break. Knowing their breeding instincts will kick into overdrive the second spring arrives, the old man sets a hard deadline to wipe them off the map. But to pull off an extermination of that scale, he's going to need some serious muscle, which means manipulating our boy. A reality that sends a bitter sting of guilt through the old ranger, as the image of Joanne's earnest gratitude flashes across his mind. Yet he pushes the hesitation aside, limping away through the trees with the cold resolve that Joanne is the only weapon he has to slaughter the horde. The comic then cuts back to the cabin, where Lizzie wakes up to a peaceful morning. Stretching the sleep from her eyes, she hears a rhythmic thudding outside and spots her husband hard at work in the shed. Curious about what the giant is up to so early, she steps out into the crisp yard to investigate. Poking her head inside, she gasps in surprise at the sight of fresh rabbits already hanging from the rafters. She excitedly asks her husband if he managed to catch another one today, prompting the big guy to rub the back of his neck as he searches for an answer. Our hero remembers earlier that morning, where his hunt wasn't exactly graceful. He had dived face first into the dirt while his furry target effortlessly hopped to safety. Picking himself up from the humiliating faceplant, he muttered in frustration that capturing it alive was officially off the table. Refusing to go home empty-handed, his eyes burned with a fierce, almost terrifying resolve to secure breakfast no matter what. Screaming at the top of his lungs, he launched himself into a frantic, flailing sprint through the woods to run the poor creature down. Back in the present, Joanne completely glosses over that clumsy struggle, smoothly claiming the catch was a breeze while Lizzie claps her hands in pure awe. Beaming with joy, she eagerly asks him how they should prepare the meat for their morning meal. Joanne suggests salting the catch, but she immediately counters with a plan to roast it over the fire, leaving him momentarily confused. Not wanting to argue with that smile, he hastily combines their ideas, enthusiastically agreeing to a salt-roasted feast. Pumping her fists with adorable determination, she promises to make the dish absolutely delicious. Soon after, he is outside carefully rotating the meat over a crackling campfire, noting how the bamboo skewers will soak the perfect smoky flavor right into the vegetables. But as he turns the spit, he notices the campfire's heat starting to fade. Staring at the dying embers, he focuses his energy and summons a tiny spark of magic on the tip of his index finger. He glares at the pathetic little flicker, admitting it's a pretty underwhelming gift, even if it might come in handy for basic survival. Shaking off the disappointment, Joanne goes back to rotating the skewers, determined to get a perfect golden brown crust before Lizzie and Dorothy start getting hungry. Suddenly, the tiny spark on his fingertip flares into an intense aggressive blaze. Panicking that he's about to incinerate his family's dinner, he frantically waves his hand to snuff it out. Staring at his now empty palm, he tries to figure out why the spell suddenly surged after failing so many times, wondering if the trigger isn't actually coming from inside him. Thinking back to his brutal fight with the giant wolf, it clicks. The flames back then weren't shot from his hands, they were ignited directly onto the beast. If his power applies straight to the target instead of channeling through his flesh, it perfectly explains why he never burns himself, prompting him to put the theory to the test. Crouching back down by the pit, he points a finger at the raw meat and pictures the heat wrapping gently around it. Squeezing his eyes shut, he focuses all his mental energy on visualizing the exact temperature needed for a flawless rotisserie roast. Right on cue, the rabbit bursts into a massive roaring pillar of fire, startling him backwards but proving his hypothesis dead right. Sure enough, the raw catch is instantly transformed into a perfectly golden sizzling meal. Joanne is absolutely amazed that he just pulled off a flawless rotisserie roast with nothing but his mind. He brings the steaming platter inside, presenting it to Lizzie, who is completely blown away by the incredible smell. Dorothy meanwhile is just hyped for the food, cheering for meat as they gather around the table. Joanne tears off massive juicy chunks and hands them over to his girls. They waste no time digging in, taking huge eager bites of the roast. And the verdict is unanimous. The magical barbecue is an absolute hit, lighting up their faces with pure delight. Taking in their happy smiles, he finally understands that old saying about feeling full just by watching your family get fed. As they share the peaceful meal, he realizes that once he grasped the trick, wielding this power became incredibly easy. Later, he takes his practice to the forest, effortlessly blasting a large rock with fire from a distance. But as he watches the stone get engulfed in the intense blaze, the terrifying, lethal potential of this ability hits him. Even so, looking down at his hands, he clenches his fists with a new resolve. Between his healing and his fire, he now has everything he needs to protect Lizzie and Dorothy from whatever this world throws at them. He remembers it clearly. That eccentric old man in the red suit who granted his desperate wish for a family. Back in the present, Joanne looks up at the sky, deciding he definitely needs to set up a Christmas altar to thank Santa for this second chance. But his quiet moment of gratitude is instantly interrupted by an excited shriek echoing from the cabin. Inside, Dorothy is absolutely zooming, excitedly promising to give their newly conscious one-horned patient the grand tour. She proudly shows off the kitchen first, declaring it the absolute center of their universe. The little monster furball just blinks from its basket, completely lost in the sauce. Undeterred, the pint-sized tour guide moves right along, enthusiastically introducing the creature to a literal wooden wall. Then she sprints over to Lizzie, plopping the basket down to make the most important introduction of all. She points to the startled woman and strictly orders the rabbit to never forget its new mother. Just then, the front door creaks open, and the little girl immediately pivots to welcome her dad home. She holds the basket up high, proudly presenting the recovered pet to the gentle giant who saved it. But then she drops an absolute bombshell of toddler logic, announcing that the rabbit's name is also Dorothy, leaving him completely blue-screened as his brain hilariously misinterprets the expanding family tree. Equally baffled by the bizarre introduction, Lizzie asks the kid to explain herself. But as she stammers, awkwardly searching for the right words, Joanne's mind races straight past the pet and off a cliff, jumping to the most dramatic conclusion possible. Staring at his wife in sheer shock, he marvels that her small slender frame could be hiding such a massive secret. Dropping to one knee, Joanne gently places a hand on Lizzie's stomach, fully convinced she's pregnant as he pictures a literal baby angel, leaving the poor woman absolutely bewildered by his sudden leap in logic.